The weathered sign barely clung to the rusted chain. "Do not approach." Tucker Bodine stared at the structure beyond, his grandfather's storm shelter, now a tomb of silence, door sealed shut with heavy padlock and chain untouched since 1954. Something had made his grandfather seal this place away forever. And now, 70 years later, Tucker was the only one left who might have the courage to find out why. 3 weeks had passed since he'd buried Roy Bodine, and still the old man's final words haunted him. "Promise me, boy, never open that shelter. Some doors are meant to stay closed." But standing here now, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the inherited ranch, Tucker felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing down like the oppressive Nebraska winter. The November wind cut across the cemetery like a confession nobody wanted to hear. Tucker Bodine stood at the edge of his grandfather's grave, hands shoved deep in his work jacket pockets, watching the last mourners drift back to their trucks. 18 people had come to see Roy Bodine buried. For a man who'd lived 87 years in Custer County, Nebraska, that wasn't many. But then Roy had been the kind of man who kept to himself, kept his distances, kept his secrets. The funeral director was packing up the green tent that had covered the grave during the brief service. Pastor Williams had said nice things about Roy's military service in World War II, his decades of ranching, his quiet contributions to the community. All true as far as it went. What the pastor hadn't mentioned was the way Roy had grown more withdrawn with each passing year, the way he'd raised Tucker's father with a strange emotional distance, the way he'd done the same with Tucker after the car accident that took both of Tucker's parents when the boy was 8 years old. Some men are shaped by what they carry. Roy Bodine had been carved hollow by it. Tucker was about to turn toward his truck when he noticed a man in a dark suit waiting by a black sedan at the cemetery gate. Not a mourner. The suit was too expensive, the posture too professional. A lawyer maybe, or someone who made a living out of other people's difficult moments. The man caught Tucker's eye and raised one hand in a slight wave. Not friendly, just acknowledgement. Tucker walked across the frozen grass. The man extended a hand. "Mr. Bodine, Clayton Hughes, attorney for your grandfather's estate. I'm sorry for your loss." The handshake was brief and formal. Hughes pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. This envelope was to be given to you after the burial, not before." He was quite insistent on that point. Tucker took the envelope. It was heavier than expected, the paper thick and yellowed with age. His name was written across the front in Roy's precise handwriting, the letters firm and vertical like fence posts. "Is there anything I need to sign?" Tucker asked. "Not today. The formal reading of the will is scheduled for Friday at my office in Broken Bow, 10 in the morning. But your grandfather wanted you to have this first." Hughes closed his briefcase with a decisive click, nodded once and walked back to his sedan. The engine started smoothly and the car pulled away, leaving Tucker alone with the envelope and the sound of wind through the bare cottonwood trees. He didn't open it there. Something about the weight of it, the deliberate secrecy, made him want to be somewhere private, somewhere he could think. He drove to the edge of town and pulled into the gravel lot of a closed gas station. The building had been abandoned for years, windows dark, pumps removed, just a concrete pad and the ghost of better times. Tucker sat in the driver's seat with the heater running and opened the envelope. Inside was a property deed to the ranch. 800 acres along the North Loop River, land that had been in the Bodine family since Roy's father homesteaded it in 1923. There was also a bank statement showing an account in Tucker's name with a balance of $127,000. His first thought was surprise. Roy had always seemed comfortable but not wealthy. His second thought was suspicion. Why hadn't Roy mentioned any of this while he was alive? At the bottom of the envelope was a single piece of paper folded once. Tucker recognized the handwriting immediately. Roy's note was brief. "The storm shelter behind the barn, sealed 1954. Do not open. Some debts can't be paid. Some truths destroy more than they heal. Your inheritance is clean if you leave it alone. I'm sorry I wasn't a better grandfather. I had my reasons. Forgive me or don't, but don't open that door. Please. Roy." Tucker read it 3 times. Each time the words made less sense and more sense simultaneously. He thought about the storm shelter. He'd seen it every summer he'd spent on the ranch as a kid, back before the accident, back when visits to Grandpa Roy's place had been an adventure instead of an obligation. The shelter was built into a hillside behind the old barn, a concrete bunker with a heavy steel door. He remembered asking about it once when he was maybe 6 years old. Roy had told him it was for tornadoes and to stay away from it. Dangerous old structure, unstable concrete, the kind of warning that makes a curious boy more curious, not less. But Tucker had never tried to open it. Even as a teenager, the one summer he'd spent on the ranch after his parents died, he'd never approached the shelter. There was something about the way Roy looked at it, the way he positioned his morning coffee routine so his back was to that hillside that communicated a boundary stronger than any lock. Now Roy was dead, and the boundary had a voice. Do not open. Written in capital letters like a command from beyond the grave. Tucker folded the note and put it back in the envelope. He sat there for a long time, watching the prairie grass bend in the wind, thinking about secrets and inheritance and the strange weight of things left unsaid. Finally, he started the truck and drove back toward Omaha. He had a job to get back to, a life such as it was, decisions to make about what to do with 800 acres of Nebraska grassland and a storm shelter full of mysteries he'd been ordered not to solve. The drive from Custer County to Omaha took 4.5 hours across landscape that flattened and then rolled and then flattened again. Tucker had made this drive dozens of times over the years, each visit to Roy shorter than the last, each conversation more stilted, until they'd settled into a pattern of silence, punctuated by weather observations and cattle prices. He told himself it was because they were different men. Roy was old-school rancher, Tucker was Army Ranger turned construction worker. Different worlds, but sitting in the truck with that note burning a hole in his jacket pocket, Tucker wondered if the distance had been something else, if Roy had been protecting him from something, or protecting himself. Omaha appeared on the horizon as the sun started to set, the buildings catching the last orange light. Tucker's apartment was in a complex on the south side, the kind of place where everyone minded their own business and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's television. He'd been living there for 3 years, ever since the divorce. Before that, he and Jennifer had owned a small house in Bellevue. The Army pension and his construction job had been enough for a mortgage and a family. But PTSD doesn't care about mortgages, and insomnia doesn't respect marriage vows. 2 tours in Afghanistan had left Tucker with reflexes he couldn't turn off and memories he couldn't talk about. Jennifer had tried. God knows she'd tried. But there's only so many nights you can wake up to your husband standing at the bedroom window, with every muscle tensed, only so many times you can ask what's wrong and get silence in return. The apartment was dark and cold when he got home. Tucker dropped his keys on the counter and stood in the kitchen, looking at the pile of mail he'd ignored for the past week. Bills, mostly. A notice from the VA about his disability claim. Still pending, still under review, still going nowhere. He opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents. 2 beers, some leftover Chinese takeout that was probably too old to eat, a half-gallon of milk. He grabbed a beer and sat down at the small table that served as his dining room, office, and storage space. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. Heard about Roy. Sorry for your loss. Melissa needs new glasses. Can you help with the cost? Her insurance doesn't cover frames. Melissa was their daughter, 9 years old, living with her mother in a nicer part of town, seeing Tucker every other weekend when his work schedule allowed it. He sent back a quick response. How much? $300. Tucker looked at the bank statement from Roy's envelope. $127,000. $300 for his daughter's glasses shouldn't be a decision he had to think about. But his own bank account had maybe $800 in it, and rent was due in 2 weeks, and his truck needed new brakes. Yeah, and the construction company he worked for had just cut everyone's hours because the winter weather was slowing down projects. He sent back another text. I'll send it Friday. Friday was payday. He'd have to skip some other payment to make it work, but that was how life went these days. Constant triage, constant decisions about which bill to let slide. The inheritance money could change that, would change that. $127,000 was life-changing money for a man living paycheck to paycheck. He could pay off debt, fix his truck, get a better apartment, help with Melissa's expenses without having to calculate and recalculate. Maybe even take some time off work, figure out what he actually wanted to do with his life instead of just surviving it. But there was the ranch too, 800 acres. The lawyer had said there would be a formal will reading on Friday. Tucker pulled out his phone and searched for ranch land prices in Custer County. The results made him sit up straighter. 800 acres of decent grassland with river access was worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million. Maybe more if someone wanted it badly enough. He set the phone down and picked up the beer. His hand was shaking slightly. Not the PTSD tremor, something else. The shake of a man's life pivoting on information he wasn't sure he could trust. $2 to $3 million. That wasn't inheritance. That was transformation. That was freedom from debt, from night shift construction work, from choosing between his daughter's glasses and his own bills. That was maybe possibly a way back to some kind of normal life. But only if he didn't open the storm shelter. Do not open. Some debts can't be paid. Some truths destroy more than they heal. Tucker finished the beer and opened the second one. What kind of truth destroys more than it heals? What kind of debt can't be paid? And why would Roy spend 70 years sitting on it only to leave this cryptic warning from beyond the grave? The questions followed him to bed that night and were still there in the morning when his alarm went off at 5:30. He dressed in his work clothes, steel-toed boots, and canvas pants worn soft from use, and drove to the construction site in the dark. The project was a new medical office building on the west side of town. Tucker's job was framing, the kind of repetitive physical work that let his mind wander while his hands stayed busy. Measuring, cutting, nailing. The rhythm of construction, the satisfaction of walls taking shape from raw lumber. His boss, Dale Kramer, was already there with coffee and a scowl. Bodine, heard about your grandfather. You need time off? No, sir, I'm good. Funeral was yesterday? Yes, sir. Dale nodded and handed him a clipboard. Basement framing today. Martinez is short a man. You're with him. Tucker worked through the morning alongside Carlos Martinez and two younger guys whose names he kept forgetting. They were good workers, fast and precise, and they didn't talk much. That suited Tucker fine. By lunch, his shoulders ached in a good way, and his mind had settled into the kind of quiet that comes from physical exhaustion. He ate a sandwich in his truck and checked his phone. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. Nebraska area code. Probably something to do with Roy's estate. He called it back. A woman's voice answered. Tucker Bodine? Speaking. This is Clayton Hughes's office. We have you scheduled for Friday at 10. We wanted to confirm you'd be able to make it. I'll be there. Good. And Mr. Bodine, there's been some interest in the property. We've had 2 inquiries about potential purchase. If you're considering selling, we could arrange for appraisals and listing immediately. Tucker felt that shake in his hand again. Who's interested? I'm not at liberty to say until after the will reading. But the offers are serious, well above market value. I'll think about it. Of course. We'll see you Friday. Tucker sat in his truck after the call ended, watching workers move across the construction site like ants building a colony. Well above market value. 2 inquiries already, and Roy hadn't been dead 3 days. Someone wanted that land badly enough to move fast. The question was why. He thought about the storm shelter again, about the steel door and the heavy chain, and the way Roy had positioned his whole life to keep his back to it, about debts and truths and destruction, about $127,000 and $2 million in land value and $300 for his daughter's glasses. The afternoon passed in a blur of framing and measuring. Tucker's hands worked while his mind spun through possibilities. At 4:30, Dale called it a day. The light was already fading, winter sunset coming early. Tucker was loading his tools into the truck when his phone rang again. Different number, but same Nebraska area code. He answered. Hello? Is this Tucker Bodine? A woman's voice, younger than the lawyer's secretary. Who's asking? My name is Grace Thornton. I'm with the Custer County Historical Society. I wanted to reach out before you make any decisions about your grandfather's property. Tucker leaned against his truck. How do you know about the property? It's a small county, Mr. Bodine. Word travels fast. I knew your grandfather. Not well, but I knew him. And I know a little bit about the history of his ranch. I was hoping I could speak with you when you come out for the will reading. What kind of history? There was a pause on the line. Tucker could hear wind in the background, the hollow sound of someone standing outside. The kind that matters to more people than just you, Grace said finally. I don't want to discuss it over the phone, but if you're planning to sell that land without understanding what you're selling, you might be making a mistake. That sounds like a threat. It's not. I promise, it's just information, history, the kind your grandfather probably never talked about. Tucker was quiet for a moment. Another person with cryptic warnings and vague implications. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. I'll be in town Friday morning, he said, 10 o'clock at the lawyer's office. I know. I could meet you afterward. There's a diner on Main Street, the Cattleman's. Say 11:30? Fine. Thank you, Mr. Bodine. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. The line went dead. Tucker put his phone away and finished loading his tools. The drive home felt longer than usual, traffic heavy with evening commuters. Back at the apartment, he made himself eat the leftover Chinese food and took a long shower, letting the hot water work on his sore shoulders. Then he sat at his table with a legal pad and started making lists: debts he owed, bills coming due, what the inheritance money could do, what selling the ranch could do. On a separate page, he wrote the questions. Who wanted to buy the ranch and why? What was in the storm shelter? What did Grace Thornton know about Roy's history? Why had Roy isolated himself for 70 years? The questions outnumbered the answers by a wide margin. Thursday passed in a fog of work and waiting. Friday morning, Tucker called in sick, threw a change of clothes in a duffel bag, and started the drive west across Nebraska. The landscape changed gradually as he left the Missouri River Valley behind. The land opened up, horizons stretching wider, the sky taking up more space. This was the Nebraska most people never saw. The empty middle where towns were 20 miles apart, and you could drive for an hour seeing nothing but grass and fence posts and the occasional windmill. He reached Broken Bow just before 10 and found the lawyer's office on the main street. Clayton Hughes was waiting in a conference room with papers spread across a polished table. The reading of the will took 15 minutes. Everything was straightforward. The ranch property went to Tucker, free and clear, no mortgage. The bank account, $127,000, also to Tucker. A few small bequests to local charities. And then one final clause read by Hughes in a flat, professional voice. Regarding the storm shelter structure, located on the northwest section of the property, I direct that it remain sealed and untouched. Any attempt to open or enter said structure will result in the immediate transfer of all property and assets to the Custer County Historical Society. Tucker looked up sharply. He put that in his will? Hughes nodded. Yes, it's unusual but legal. If you open that shelter, you forfeit everything. The land, the money, all of it goes to the Historical Society. Did he say why? No, just that clause. I advised him it was strange, but he insisted. Tucker sat back in his chair. The Historical Society. Grace Thornton had said she was with the Historical Society. She'd called him the day after Roy died. How had she known so quickly? Had she been waiting for this moment? He signed the papers transferring the deed to his name and accepted copies of everything. Hughes walked him to the door with a final handshake. The two parties interested in purchasing the property are serious buyers, Hughes said. I can arrange meetings if you'd like. Who are they? One is a development company out of Lincoln. The other is Senator Raymond Carlisle. He owns several properties in the county. Both have indicated they'd pay premium prices. I'll think about it. Tucker walked out into the late morning sunshine. Main Street was quiet, a few pickup trucks parked at the hardware store, an old woman walking a small dog. The diner was 3 blocks down, easy to spot by the faded sign showing a cartoon cowboy with a cup of coffee. Tucker checked his watch. 11:20. He went inside. The Cattleman's diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease and decades of absorbed conversations. Tucker took a booth by the window and ordered coffee from a waitress who looked about 60 and called him Hon. He was halfway through his first cup when the door opened and a woman walked in. She was in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a canvas jacket. She had the kind of face that looked comfortable outdoors, wind-weathered and honest. She spotted Tucker immediately and walked over. Mr. Bodine? Tucker! Grace Thornton. She slid into the booth across from him and ordered coffee without looking at the menu. Then she pulled out a folder and set it on the table between them. Thank you for meeting me. I know this must be a strange time. Strange is one word for it. Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee cup when it arrived. How much do you know about your grandfather's work in the 1950s? He was a rancher. Before that, he served in World War II. That's about it. He was also a county surveyor from 1952 to 1954. Did you know that? Tucker shook his head. He surveyed property boundaries, documented land transfers, verified titles. It was an official position appointed by the county commissioners. Grace opened her folder and pulled out a photocopy of an old document. This is the county records from that period. Your grandfather surveyed 18 different ranches in those 2 years, all of them along the North Loop River. All of them went through some kind of ownership transfer during that time. Tucker looked at the document. It was hard to read, old typewriter text on degraded paper, but he could make out Roy's signature at the bottom of each survey report. So he did his job, Tucker said. What's the problem? Grace pulled out another document. This is the property record for the Thornton Ranch. 800 acres, homesteaded by my great-grandfather in 1889. Mortgage paid off in 1947. My grandfather owned it free and clear. Owned? Past tense. He lost it in September 1953, foreclosure. He was serving in Korea at the time. My grandmother was running the ranch with 3 small children. She missed one mortgage payment because the cattle market crashed and winter killed half their calves. The bank foreclosed within 30 days. The judge approved it in a closed hearing. The sheriff evicted my grandmother and her children in 48 hours. The property was sold to Carlisle Land Company for $12,000. It was worth at least $180,000. Tucker was quiet, processing. Grace's eyes were bright with intensity, but not tears. This was old pain, generations removed but still sharp. I'm sorry that happened to your family, Tucker said carefully. But what does it have to do with my grandfather? He surveyed the property 2 weeks before the foreclosure. His signature is on the documents that transferred ownership. And Tucker, my grandfather, was deployed to Korea under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Federal law prohibited foreclosure on deployed military personnel without court order proving the inability to pay wasn't related to military service. That hearing never happened. The foreclosure was illegal. Tucker felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're saying my grandfather was part of an illegal foreclosure? I'm saying I've found 17 other families with the exact same story. Servicemen deployed to Korea between 1952 and 1953. Small financial difficulties. Immediate foreclosure. Same judge approving every case. Same sheriff conducting evictions. Same 3 companies buying the properties well below market value. And your grandfather surveyed every single one of them. She pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table. Property records, foreclosure notices, bills of sale. Tucker saw Roy's signature on dozens of them. Neat, precise, official. Who were the 3 companies, he asked, though part of him already knew. Carlisle Land Company, Prewitt Holdings, and Mason Development. Between them, they acquired 23,000 acres during those 2 years. All from military families. All while the men were deployed and couldn't defend their property. Tucker sat back. Senator Raymond Carlisle. His grandfather was Judge Walter Carlisle. He signed every foreclosure order. Sheriff Frank Pruitt was the current sheriff's grandfather. Banker Howard Mason was the president of First County Bank. And your grandfather surveyed and documented every transfer. The waitress came by to refill their coffee. Tucker waited until she was gone before speaking. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 10 years researching what happened to my family. 10 years piecing together a conspiracy that stole land from military families while they were serving their country. And I can prove the pattern, I can show the timeline, I can demonstrate the statistical impossibility of 18 families losing their ranches in 2 years through legitimate foreclosure. But I can't prove coordination. I can't prove it was deliberate conspiracy. All the documents show legal process, however rushed and suspicious. I can't prove they planned it. She leaned forward. But your grandfather could. He was there. He worked with all of them. He surveyed the properties, he saw the process, he signed the documents. If anyone knew it was conspiracy, it was Roy Bodine. And 3 days after you inherited his property, Senator Carlisle wants to buy it well above market value with the specific condition that a storm shelter built in 1954 must be demolished without being opened. Tucker felt the pieces sliding together. The sealed shelter, Roy's warning, the clause in the will, Grace's research. All of it pointed to one conclusion he didn't want to believe. You think there's evidence in that shelter? I think your grandfather sealed something in that shelter 70 years ago and spent the rest of his life making sure it stayed sealed. I think whatever is in there could prove what happened to my family and 17 others. And I think the people whose fortunes were built on that theft will do anything to keep it buried. Tucker looked out the window at Main Street. A pickup truck drove past slowly, the driver glancing at the diner. In a town this small, everyone would know by now that Roy Bodine's grandson was in town. Everyone would be watching. The will says if I open the shelter, I lose everything, Tucker said. The land, the money, all of it goes to the Historical Society. I didn't know that, Grace said quietly. But it makes sense. It was his insurance policy. If someone tried to force you to open it, you'd lose your inheritance anyway. It protected you from being pressured. Or it was protecting the secret, making sure I'd never open it. Maybe both. Tucker finished his coffee. His mind was racing through implications and possibilities. $127,000. $2 million in land value. His daughter's glasses and his bills, and his whole future balanced against history and justice and families he'd never met. I need to see the ranch, he said finally. I need to see this shelter. Grace nodded. I can show you the property records. I have copies of everything I've found. No, I need to see it in person. I need to stand there and decide what kind of man I want to be. They left the diner together and drove separately out of town. Tucker followed Grace's truck down Highway 183 and then onto county roads that got progressively smaller. The ranch was 20 minutes from Broken Bow, tucked into a valley where the North Loop River curved through grassland. Tucker recognized the turn onto the property even though he hadn't been here in 15 years. The gate was new, but the fence posts were the same, weathered cedar that Roy's father had probably set 100 years ago. The house sat on a small rise overlooking the river. It was a simple ranch style from the 1940s, white siding and a green roof, a front porch with 2 chairs. Roy's truck was still parked by the barn, covered in dust. Everything looked exactly as Tucker remembered it from childhood summers, except quieter, emptier. The kind of empty that comes when the person who gave a place meaning is gone. Grace parked and got out. Tucker did the same, boots crunching on the gravel drive. The November wind was stronger out here, nothing to break it across the open prairie. He could see cattle in the distance, grazing on grass that was going dormant for winter. His cattle now. His land. His inheritance built on what exactly? The shelter is behind the barn, Grace said. They walked around the weathered building. Roy had kept the barn in good repair, fresh paint and solid doors. But the area behind it was overgrown. Tall grass and scrub brush, ground sloping up to a hillside. And there, built into the rise, was the storm shelter. It looked exactly as Tucker remembered. Concrete walls forming a small bunker, a heavy steel door painted industrial gray, a massive padlock and chain wrapped multiple times around the handle. The chain looked new, or newer than it should be for something sealed in 1954. Roy must have maintained it, replaced it over the years. Keeping the door shut wasn't just about rust and time, it was about intention. There was a sign on the door, hand-painted in red letters. Danger, keep out. Tucker walked closer. Grace hung back, giving him space. He put his hand on the steel door and felt the cold metal through his palm. Somewhere inside this bunker was the truth about Roy Bodine, about the ranch, about 18 families and stolen land, and the conspiracy that Grace had spent 10 years trying to prove. Do not open. Some debts can't be paid. Some truths destroy more than they heal. He stepped back and looked at Grace. Your family's ranch, the Thornton place. Where is it now? Grace pointed east. About 3 miles that way. It's still called Thornton Ranch, but Senator Carlisle owns it. Has for 70 years. He runs 2,000 head of cattle on land his grandfather stole from mine. And the other 17 families? Same story. All the properties are still productive. All owned by the descendants of the men who stole them. The Carlisle family controls 45,000 acres now. Built an empire on theft. Tucker looked back at the shelter. An empire built on theft. His inheritance might be built the same way. Roy had been the surveyor. He'd signed the documents. He'd been part of it. I need to think, Tucker said. They walked back to their trucks. Grace gave him her phone number and address. Whatever you decide, I understand, she said. This is your inheritance. Your future. I've got no right to ask you to give that up for history. But you're asking anyway. I'm asking you to think about what's right. My grandfather came home from Korea to find his family homeless. He drank himself to death by the time he was 42. He died thinking he'd failed them. If there's proof it wasn't his fault, if there's evidence it was theft, don't his children and grandchildren deserve to know the truth? She got in her truck and drove away. Tucker stood in the driveway watching dust settle back onto the road. Then he walked up to the house. The front door was unlocked. Roy had never locked doors in his life. Inside, the house smelled like old coffee and wood smoke and decades of quiet living. Everything was neat, everything in its place. Roy had been a man of order and precision. Tucker walked through the room slowly. The kitchen with its small table and 2 chairs. The living room with a worn recliner facing a television that looked 20 years old. The bedroom where Roy had slept alone for as long as Tucker could remember. and the study. This room Tucker had never been allowed in as a child. Roy's private office, door always closed. Tucker pushed it open now. The room was lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. A desk sat under the window, papers stacked neatly, pens in a holder. On the bar hall, photographs in simple frames. Roy in his Army uniform, Tucker's father as a young man, Tucker himself at maybe 5 years old, sitting on a tractor and grinning. Tucker sat down at the desk. The top drawer was unlocked. Inside were Roy's surveyor notebooks, leather-bound and filled with meticulous handwriting. Tucker pulled out the one dated 1952 to 1954. He flipped through pages of measurements and coordinates, property descriptions, and boundary markers. Roy's work had been thorough and professional, every detail documented with care. Then Tucker noticed something. In the margins of several pages, tiny notes in pencil, almost too faint to read. Johnson family, husband in Korea, wife couldn't make one payment, bank foreclosed immediately. Peterson Ranch, 5 generations, lost in 90 days while son serving overseas. McCall property, forged signature on refinancing documents. Tucker felt his hands go cold. Roy hadn't just known it was wrong, he'd documented it. He'd written the questions right there in his official notebooks. Questions he'd never asked out loud, never pursued, just noted quietly in the margins while he signed the documents and collected his fees. He kept looking through the desk drawers. In the bottom one, locked but easily forced with a letter opener, he found a sealed envelope addressed in Roy's handwriting. To whoever opens the vault. Tucker's pulse quickened. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, old and yellowed, but still clear. 5 men standing in front of the storm shelter, holding shovels, faces grim with purpose. Tucker recognized Roy immediately, younger but already carrying that look of distance in his eyes. Next to him, 4 other men. Written on the back in Roy's precise handwriting were their names. Judge Walter Carlisle, Sheriff Frank Pruitt, Banker Howard Mason, Developer Kenneth Hayes, and me. August 1954. The 5 of us know what we did. We buried the proof. I buried my conscience. God forgive us. Tucker stared at the photograph for a long time. The 5 conspirators. The men who had stolen land from military families. The men who had built fortunes on that theft. And Roy Bodine, surveyor, accomplice, co-conspirator. The grandfather who had raised Tucker with emotional distance and quiet shame now made terrible sense. How could you love a grandson built on blood money? How could you show affection when everything you owned came from betrayal? Tucker's phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but the number was local. Mr. Bodine, this is Senator Raymond Carlisle. I wanted to reach out personally about your grandfather's property. The voice was smooth, educated, confident. The voice of a man used to getting what he wanted. Senator, I understand Clayton Hughes mentioned my interest in purchasing the ranch. I'd like to make a formal offer, $2.8 million cash with a quick close, 30 days or less. That's generous. It's fair market value, perhaps a bit more, but I have sentimental reasons. My grandfather knew your grandfather well. They were business associates. I'd like to reconnect some of that family land, honor the past properly. Tucker looked down at the photograph in his hand, the 5 men with shovels. Business associates. There's one condition, Carlisle continued. The old storm shelter on the property needs to be demolished and as part of the sale. County safety regulations. Old concrete, potential liability. My contractors will handle it professionally. The contents will be disposed of properly. Why do you care about a storm shelter? There was the briefest pause. I don't care about it specifically. It's simply a liability issue. Old structures like that can be dangerous. I'm sure you understand. Tucker understood perfectly. Carlisle wanted the shelter destroyed, wanted it demolished without being opened, wanted the truth buried for another 70 years. I need time to think about it, Tucker said. Of course, but I'd encourage you not to wait too long. I have other properties I'm looking at. This offer won't be available indefinitely. The line went dead. Tucker set his phone down and looked at the photograph again. 5 men burying proof. 5 men sealing a shelter. 5 men who had lived their whole lives protecting a secret that had destroyed 18 families and built 3 fortunes. Roy Bodine had been one of them. The inheritance Tucker was holding, the money that could change his life, the land that could set him free from debt and struggle, all of it came from theft and betrayal. His grandfather hadn't been a quiet rancher keeping to himself. He'd been a guilty man carrying shame so heavy it had carved him hollow. Tucker put the photograph in his pocket and walked back outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prairie. He walked to the storm shelter one more time and stood in front of that steel door. His future was on one side of this decision. Justice for 18 families was on the other. And somewhere in between was the question of what kind of man Tucker Bodine wanted to be. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. Tucker put his hand on the padlock. It was solid, heavy, designed to last. Roy had made sure this door would stay closed, had made it illegal for Tucker to open it through the clause in the will, had protected the secret and protected Tucker from the consequences of uncovering it. But he'd also left that photograph, left those margin notes, left a trail of breadcrumbs for someone brave enough or foolish enough to follow. Tucker stood there as the sun sank below the horizon and the prairie turned purple in the twilight. Inside that shelter was the truth. Outside was $2.8 million and a fresh start and freedom from the weight of other people's history. He thought about his daughter needing glasses. He thought about Grace Thornton's grandfather drinking himself to death after losing everything. He thought about Roy sitting alone in this house for 70 years, unable to make things right, but unable to completely destroy the evidence either. Some debts can't be paid. Some truths destroy more than they heal. Tucker turned away from the shelter and walked back to his truck. He had decisions to make, but not tonight. Tonight he needed to think, to weigh consequences, to figure out if opening that door was an act of courage or an act of self-destruction. He drove back to Broken Bow and got a room at the only motel in town. Lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, took out the photograph and studied those 5 faces. His grandfather looked young in the picture, maybe 40 years old. The age Tucker was now, a whole life ahead of him, a whole life he'd spent carrying guilt. Tucker's phone buzzes, a text from Jennifer. Did you send the money for Melissa's glasses? He'd forgotten. With everything happening, he'd completely forgotten. He opened his banking app and transferred $300, leaving his account with less than $500 until next payday. Then he looked at Roy's bank statement. $127,000. Enough to solve every problem Tucker had. Enough to transform his life. If he could live with how it was earned. He turned off the light and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he would decide. Tomorrow he would choose between inheritance and truth. Between his future and justice for people he'd never met. But tonight, lying in a cheap motel in the middle of Nebraska, Tucker Bodine dreamed about storm shelters and secrets, and the weight of sins passed down through generations, like land deeds and family names. Tucker woke at 3 in the morning with his heart pounding and his shirt soaked through with sweat. The dream had been the usual one, the roadside bomb in Kandahar, the spray of dirt and blood, the screaming that never quite stopped even after you open your eyes. But this time there had been something different. This time the faces of the wounded had been old men in work clothes, farmers and ranchers, and they'd all been asking him the same question. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? He sat up in the motel bed and turned on the lamp. The photograph of the 5 conspirators lay on the nightstand where he'd left it before trying to sleep. Roy Bodine and 4 other men, shovels in hand, faces grim with the weight of what they'd done. Tucker picked it up and studied his grandfather's expression. There was no pride there, no satisfaction. Just the look of a man doing something he knew was wrong and doing it anyway. The motel room was cold. Tucker got up and turned the heater higher, then stood at the window looking out at Main Street Broken Bow. A single street light illuminated empty pavement. Nothing moved. The whole town was asleep, comfortable in beds bought with honest money, or maybe not so honest money. Who could say anymore? Grace Thornton had spent 10 years researching the theft of her family's ranch. 10 years piecing together a conspiracy that had destroyed 18 families while their men were overseas fighting a war. And she'd found the pattern, found the timeline, found everything except proof of coordination. Everything except evidence that would stand up in court and force the world to acknowledge what had happened. That evidence was in the storm shelter. Tucker knew it as surely as he knew his own name. Roy had buried it there in 1954 and spent 70 years making sure it stayed buried. The question Tucker couldn't answer, lying awake in a cheap motel at 3 in the morning, was why? Why seal the evidence instead of destroying it? Why keep proof of your own crimes for 7 decades? Why leave breadcrumbs in the form of margin notes and photographs if you never intended for anyone to follow the trail? Maybe Roy had been waiting for someone else to make the choice he couldn't make himself. Maybe sealing that shelter had been his compromise with conscience. preserving the truth without having to face the consequences of revealing it. Cowardice dressed up as caution. Or maybe it had been something else. Maybe Roy had believed that someday, somehow, justice would matter more than money. That truth would matter more than comfort. Tucker got dressed and sat at the small table by the window. He pulled out his phone and opened the calculator app. Started doing math he'd already done a dozen times but needed to do again. If he sold the ranch to Senator Carlisle for $2.8 million, after taxes he'd clear about $2 million. Enough to pay off every debt he had, set up a college fund for Melissa, buy a house, start over clean. He could quit construction, maybe go back to school, get some kind of degree that didn't require physical labor. His back wouldn't ache every morning. His hands wouldn't be scarred and calloused. He could be the kind of father who showed up to school events in clean clothes instead of work boots caked with mud. But he'd know every time he looked at his daughter, every time he wrote a check from that clean money, he'd know where it came from. He'd know that 18 families had lost everything while their men were serving their country, and he'd profited from that theft. He'd be exactly what Roy had been, a man carrying shame so heavy it carved him hollow. Tucker closed the calculator and opened his email instead. Started typing. Grace, I need to see the families. The ones who lost their ranches. I need to hear their stories. Can you set up meetings? Tucker. He sent it at 3:17 in the morning and didn't expect a response until daylight. But his phone buzzed 2 minutes later. I can have 3 families ready to meet you this afternoon. The others are scattered across the state, but I can arrange calls. Grace. She'd been awake too. Probably had been awake every night for 10 years, researching and documenting and hoping someone would care enough to help her prove what she already knew. Tucker typed back, "This afternoon works. I'll be at the ranch." He tried to sleep for another hour but gave up at 4:30. Showered, dressed, checked out of the motel, and drove to an all-night gas station on the edge of town. The attendant was half asleep, a kid maybe 19 with headphones in and a textbook open on the counter. Tucker filled his truck and bought coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since yesterday, drove out to the ranch as the sun came up. The November morning was clear and cold, frost on the grass turning the prairie silver. Tucker parked by the house and walked the property as light spread across the land. 800 acres along the North Loop River, good grazing land, water rights, everything a rancher could want. Roy had maintained it well. The fences were solid, the pastures managed properly, the cattle healthy. This was good land, productive land, the kind of place a man could build a life on, or build an empire on if you had enough of it. 45,000 acres, Grace had said. That's what the Carlisle family controlled now. Land acquired from military families during a 2-year window when the men were deployed and couldn't defend their property. Coordinated theft disguised as legal foreclosure. And Roy Bodine had surveyed every transfer, signed every document, collected his fees, and stayed silent. Tucker walked to the storm shelter. In the morning light, it looked less ominous and more sad. Just a concrete bunker built into a hillside, sealed and forgotten, containing secrets that had poisoned 3 generations. He put his hand on the cold steel door again, felt the weight of the padlock and chain. Roy had made this door impossible to open casually. You'd need bolt cutters at minimum, probably a pry bar, definitely intention. Nobody stumbled into this shelter by accident. His phone rang. Grace, the first family can meet you at 10 this morning. Martha Yates. She's 78, lives in town. Her father lost his ranch in 1953. I'll be there. Tucker, are you sure about this? Once you hear their stories, once you see what was taken from them, it's going to be harder to walk away. I know. And if you decide to open that shelter, you lose everything. The will is clear. The Historical Society gets the land and the money. I know that too. Grace was quiet for a moment. Martha lives on Elm Street, 4th house on the left. White house with blue shutters. I'll meet you there. Tucker drove back to town, found the house easily. It was small and neat, the yard well maintained despite the season. Grace's truck was already there. She met him on the front walk. Martha's sharp, Grace said quietly, but talking about this takes a toll. Be patient. An old woman opened the door before they could knock. She was small and thin, white hair pulled back, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. She looked at Tucker with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're Roy Bodine's grandson. Yes, ma'am. You look like him. Same jaw, same eyes. She stepped back. Come in. The living room was furnished simply. Photos on every surface, generations of family captured in frames. Martha settled into a recliner and gestured to the couch. Grace tells me you're thinking about opening Roy's shelter. I'm considering it. Because you want justice? Or because you're curious? Tucker met her gaze. I don't know yet, maybe both. Martha nodded slowly. At least you're honest. My father was Daniel Yates. He owned 640 acres north of here. His father homesteaded it in 1892. 3 generations of Yates men worked that land. My father was the 4th generation, and he was supposed to pass it to my brother. That was the plan. She picked up a framed photograph from the side table, showed it to Tucker. A young man in military uniform, serious expression, proud bearing. Daniel Yates, 1952. He got his draft notice in March. He was 34 years old, married with 3 kids, running a successful cattle operation. The Service Members Civil Relief Act should have protected him, should have made it impossible to foreclose while he was deployed. But the bank found a way. Martha's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly, holding the photograph. My mother was running the ranch. My father had taught her everything. She could work cattle, fix fences, manage the books. But that winter was hard. Cattle prices dropped because of the war, supply and demand. Korea needed beef, but the government was buying at fixed prices that didn't account for our increased costs. My mother made every payment she could, but in January '53, she was short. One payment. She went to the bank and explained the situation. Asked for an extension until spring when she could sell calves. The banker was Howard Mason. He smiled and said he understood. Said not to worry. Said they'd work something out. Grace leaned forward. 2 weeks later, the foreclosure notice came. Martha nodded. 30 days to pay the full outstanding balance, not just the missed payment. The full balance. My mother didn't have that kind of cash on hand. Nobody did in winter. She tried to get a loan from another bank, but somehow they all knew about the foreclosure. Doors closed. My father was in Korea and communication took weeks. By the time he got her letter and tried to respond, it was too late. Judge Carlisle approved the foreclosure in a closed hearing. Grace added. Martha's mother wasn't even notified it was happening. Sheriff Pruitt came to evict us on a Tuesday morning, Martha said. Her voice had gone flat, reciting facts to keep emotion at bay. I was 8 years old. I remember my mother begging him for more time, just until my father got home, just until spring. He said he was sorry, but he had a court order. We had 48 hours to remove our personal belongings. Everything else belonged to the bank now. Tucker felt something cold spreading through his chest. Where did you go? My mother's sister had a farmhouse 10 miles away. We moved in with them, 7 people in a 3-bedroom house. My mother took work cleaning houses in town. My father came home from Korea in June to find his family living in someone else's house and his ranch sold to Carlisle Land Company for $16,000. The land was worth at least $200,000. Did he try to fight it? Martha's laugh was bitter. He tried everything. Hired a lawyer who said the foreclosure was technically legal, even if it was morally wrong. Applied to the VA for assistance and got denied because he still had income potential. Never mind that his income had been stolen. Wrote letters to his congressman, to the VA, to anyone who would listen. Got back form letters about how unfortunate it was, but nothing could be done. She set the photograph down carefully. My father started drinking in 1954. By 57, he couldn't hold a job. By 59, he was dead. Liver failure at 42 years old. My mother raised 3 kids alone, cleaning houses and taking in laundry. She died in 1973, 61 years old, worn out from working 3 jobs for 20 years. Neither of them ever got over losing that ranch. It broke something in both of them. The room was silent. Tucker looked at the photographs on the walls. Generations of a family built on hard work and land stewardship ended by a coordinated conspiracy that stole their home while the patriarch was serving his country. Your grandfather surveyed our property 2 weeks before the foreclosure, Martha said. I found the documents when I was researching our family history. Roy Bodine's signature is on the transfer papers. He knew what was happening, and he did nothing. I'm sorry, Tucker said. The words felt inadequate. Sorry doesn't bring back my father. Sorry doesn't give my mother those 20 years she spent scrubbing other people's floors. Sorry doesn't undo what was done. Martha's eyes were fierce. But proof might. Evidence might. If there's documentation in that shelter showing it was conspiracy, showing it was coordinated theft, Then maybe my father wasn't a failure. Maybe he was a victim. Maybe my mother's sacrifice meant something. Tucker nodded slowly. If I open that shelter, I lose my inheritance. Everything goes to the historical society. I know. Grace told me that's a hell of a choice for a young man to make. I'm 30 years old. I've got a daughter to support and debts I can barely manage. That inheritance could change my life. Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to a drawer, pulled out a folder and handed it to Tucker. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in careful handwriting and on thin paper. My father's letters from Korea. He wrote to my mother almost every day, read the last page. Tucker opened the final letter. The date was April 1953, postmarked from Korea. The handwriting was shaky, tired. Darling, I got your letter about the foreclosure. I can't believe they would do this while I'm deployed. The SCRA is supposed to protect us. I'm writing to the base legal office, but they say it will take months to sort out. I'm trying to get emergency leave, but my CO says no. The fighting is heavy here and they need every man. I'm scared, Mary, not of the Chinese or the North Koreans. I'm scared of losing everything we built. I'm scared of coming home to nothing. Tell the children I love them. Tell them their daddy is fighting to get home and make this right. I promise I'll fix this. I promise, Dan. Tucker closed the folder. His hands were shaking. He didn't fix it, Martha said quietly, because he couldn't, because the system was rigged against him, because men with money and power wanted his land and took it. Your grandfather was part of that. Your inheritance is built on my father's broken promises. Tucker handed back the folder, stood up. Thank you for telling me this. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, but I needed to hear it. Outside, Grace walked with him to his truck. The morning had warmed slightly, but Tucker felt cold all the way through. There are 2 more families who want to talk to you, Grace said. If you can handle it, set it up. The second meeting was at a small ranch house outside of town. Robert Chen was 65, a quiet man who worked as an accountant in Broken Bow. His grandfather had been one of the few Chinese-American ranchers in the county. My grandfather came to Nebraska in 1928, Robert said. They sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee. He worked for the railroad first, then saved enough to buy land, 40 acres. He built it up to 400 acres by 1945. My father was born here, grew up American, served in Korea with pride. And lost the ranch while serving, Grace prompted gently. Robert nodded. 1953. My grandmother missed a property tax payment. She was 2 weeks late. The county initiated foreclosure proceedings immediately. My grandfather was in Korea. He sent money home, but it arrived too late. Judge Carlisle ruled the foreclosure valid. Prewitt Development bought the land for $8,000. It was worth $90,000. The speed of the foreclosure was unusual, Grace added. Property tax foreclosures normally take months. This one took 3 weeks. My family always believed it was because we were Chinese, Robert said, that someone wanted our land and used my father's deployment as an opportunity. We could never prove it, but the timing was too perfect. 2 weeks late on taxes and we lose everything? He pulled out a photograph. An older Asian man standing in front of a small house, American flag flying from the porch. My grandfather. He came home from Korea to find his parents living in a rented apartment in town. He tried to buy back the land, but Prewitt wouldn't sell. Offered twice what they paid, 3 times. Didn't matter. They wanted to keep it. My grandfather worked construction for 40 years after that. Never owned land again. He died thinking he dishonored his parents by losing what they'd built. Tucker looked at the photograph. The man's face showed the same expression Roy had carried. Shame, distance, the weight of failure that wasn't really failure but felt like it anyway. If there's evidence of racial targeting in that shelter, Robert said, if there's proof they specifically went after my family because we were vulnerable and different, then my grandfather's name deserves to be cleared. He wasn't a failure, he was targeted. The third meeting was the hardest. Pastor Edwin Cross was 71, a Methodist minister who'd served churches across Nebraska for 4 decades. He invited Tucker and Grace to his church office, a small room lined with books and crosses. My father was 1/4 Lakota, Edwin said. His grandmother was from the Rosebud Reservation. My father was proud of his heritage, even though it complicated things in Nebraska in the 1940s and 50s. He ran cattle on 320 acres. Good land, well managed. The foreclosure came in September 1953, Grace said, reading from her notes. The bank claimed there was a defect in the original title from the homestead claim in 1894, said the land had never been properly transferred from federal to private ownership. Edwin's expression was bitter. Funny how that defect was only discovered when my father was deployed to Korea and couldn't defend himself. Funny how it was resolved quickly in favor of the bank. Funny how Mason Development ended up with our land for $12,000 when it was worth $150,000. The title defect was manufactured, Grace said. I found the original homestead documents. They're perfectly valid. But in 1953, with my father overseas, there was no one to challenge the bank's claim in time. Edwin stood and walked to his window. The church parking lot was empty, leaves skittering across the pavement in the wind. My father came home to find his family's land gone. His mother, my grandmother, was living with relatives on the reservation. She was 80 years old and she died 6 months later. My father always believed the loss of that land killed her, that she couldn't survive losing the home she'd built from nothing. He turned back to Tucker. I became a minister because I needed to believe in justice, divine justice, since human justice failed my family. But maybe there's a chance for both. If you open that shelter, if you expose what was done, if you make them acknowledge it, I'd lose everything, Tucker said. You'd lose money, but you might gain something more important. You might gain the knowledge that you did the right thing, that when it mattered, you chose justice over comfort. Tucker drove back to the ranch with Grace following. They sat in his grandfather's study while Tucker went through more of Roy's notebooks. The margin notes were everywhere once you knew to look for them. Small penciled observations that told a story of a man watching crimes happen and documenting them without stopping them. Peterson family, evicted in 48 hours, children crying. Chen property, racial targeting obvious but unprovable. Cross land, title defect created specifically for this foreclosure. Grace found a locked drawer in one of the filing cabinets. Tucker forced it with a screwdriver. Inside were photocopies of documents, bank memos discussing target properties, Judge Carlisle's notes about timing foreclosures while soldiers were deployed, Sheriff Pruitt's eviction schedules coordinated to hit multiple families in rapid succession. This is it, Grace breathed. This is proof of coordination. Roy copied everything and hid it. Why, Tucker asked. Why keep evidence of his own crimes? Maybe he couldn't destroy it. Maybe some part of him knew it was wrong and this was his way of preserving the truth. Tucker's phone rang. Unknown number, he answered. Mr. Bodine, this is Sheriff Dale Pruitt. I need to speak with you about your grandfather's property. Can you come to my office? I'm at the ranch now. I'll come to you. 20 minutes. The line went dead. Grace looked worried. The sheriff is Frank Pruitt's grandson. His family benefited from the theft too. Pruitt Holdings still owns 6,000 acres acquired during the foreclosures. Maybe he wants to help. Or maybe he wants to make sure we don't cause trouble. Sheriff Pruitt arrived in a county vehicle alone. He was in his late 50s, weather-worn face, the kind of bearing that came from years of enforcing law in a rural county. He shook Tucker's hand with a firm grip. I heard you've been meeting with some of the old families, talking about the foreclosures from the 50s. Is that a problem? It's stirring up history that's been settled for 70 years. Some people aren't happy about it. Some people being Senator Carlisle? Pruitt's jaw tightened. The senator is concerned about community stability. So am I. Look, I know what you've probably heard. I know my grandfather was involved in those foreclosures. I've lived with that knowledge my whole life. Lived with it comfortably on land your grandfather stole, Grace said. Pruitt turned to her. Miss Thornton, I know you've been researching this for years. I know what your family lost, but what do you think you're going to accomplish? You think opening Roy's shelter is going to change anything? It might prove what happened was illegal, Tucker said. Might give 18 families justice they've been denied. Justice? After 70 years? Half those families are dead. The ones who aren't are old. And what about the current owners? People who bought land in good faith decades ago? You want to void their titles, destroy their property values, create legal chaos across the entire county? The truth matters, Grace said. The truth is complicated, Pruitt countered. Yes, those foreclosures were rushed. Yes, the timing was suspicious. But they followed legal process. Judges signed orders. Banks foreclosed according to law. Whether it was moral is a different question. But it was legal. Tucker stood. The Service Members Civil Relief Act makes it illegal to foreclose on deployed military personnel without proving the inability to pay isn't related to service. Those hearings never happened. The foreclosures violated federal law. Prove it. In court, 70 years later, with original parties dead and documents scattered, you'd need ironclad evidence. Maybe that evidence exists. Prewitt's expression hardened. In Roy's shelter, which you legally cannot open without forfeiting your inheritance. Smart man, your grandfather made sure no one could be pressured into revealing what he hid, or pressured into keeping it secret. Prewitt walked to the window looking out at the Nebraska prairie. I'm not my grandfather, Tucker. I didn't steal anyone's land. I've tried to be a good sheriff, serve the community fairly, but I've also benefited from what my grandfather did. The house I live in, the land my family owns, all of it came from those foreclosures. You think I don't know that? You think I sleep easy? Then help us, Grace said. Help us prove what really happened. I can't. Even if I wanted to, I can't. The minute I start investigating 70-year-old crimes committed by my own grandfather, I compromise any potential case. District attorney would have to recuse me. State would have to bring in outside investigators. It would take years. So we do nothing? Tucker asked. I'm saying think carefully about what you're starting. You open that shelter, you lose your inheritance. You might prove conspiracy, or you might just find old papers that don't prove anything in court. Either way, you've destroyed your own future for uncertain justice. Prewitt turned to leave, then stopped at the door. One more thing. Senator Carlisle has a lot of influence in this county, a lot of friends. If you become a problem, if you threaten to expose things that certain powerful people want to stay buried, there will be consequences. I can't protect you from that. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who knows how this county works. After Prewitt left, Grace and Tucker sat in silence. The sun was setting, long shadows across the prairie. Tucker felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Martha Yates's father drinking himself to death. Robert Chen's grandfather living with shame that wasn't his to carry. Edwin Cross's grandmother dying after losing her home. 18 families destroyed while their men served overseas. And Roy Bodine, surveying and documenting it all, signing the papers, collecting his fees, and sealing the evidence in a concrete bunker. I should go, Grace said finally. Let you think. Stay. Please, I don't want to be alone with this. They made coffee and sat at Roy's kitchen table. Outside, the prairie turned purple in the twilight. Grace pulled out her laptop and showed Tucker more of her research. Newspaper articles from 1953 mentioning the foreclosures in passing. Property transfer records showing the pattern. VA correspondence with families seeking help and being denied. A decade of work, meticulously documented, proving everything except the one thing that mattered most. Coordination. Conspiracy. Proof that it had been planned. If we open that shelter, Grace said quietly, and there's no proof inside, we've accomplished nothing. You lose everything and we still can't prove conspiracy. But if there is proof, then we expose it. Take it to federal authorities. Service Member Civil Relief Act violations are federal crimes with no statute of limitations. We might actually get justice. Tucker's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Stop asking questions. Stop meeting with the families. Walk away while you still can. He showed it to Grace. Her face went pale. They're watching us. Let them watch. Tucker sent back a single word. No. They talked until midnight, going through every document Grace had collected, every piece of evidence, every timeline, building the case that could be made if only they had proof of coordination. At some point, Tucker realized he'd made his decision. Somewhere between Martha Yates's father's letters and Edwin Cross's grandmother dying of a broken heart, between the margin notes in Roy's notebooks and the photocopied memos in the locked drawer, he'd stopped thinking about the money and started thinking about justice. I'm going to open it, he said. The shelter. I'm going to open it and see what Roy left us. Grace looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and fear. You'll lose everything. I'll lose money. I won't lose myself. They made a plan. Saturday night, 3 days away. Time to gather tools, prepare documentation, arrange to upload anything they found immediately to multiple locations. Time for Tucker to settle his affairs, say goodbye to the inheritance he'd had for less than a week. Grace left around 1 in the morning. Tucker walked her to her truck. Thank you, she said, for caring, for listening, for choosing to do this. Don't thank me yet. We don't know what's in there. We know Roy thought it was important enough to seal away for 70 years. That's something. Tucker went back inside and tried to sleep. Couldn't. Lay in his grandfather's bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about choices and consequences, and the strange inheritance of other people's crimes. At some point, he dozed off. He woke to the sound of breaking glass. Tucker was on his feet instantly, combat reflexes kicking in. The sound had come from downstairs. He moved to the bedroom door and listened. Silence. Then footsteps. Multiple people moving through the house. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. Custer County Sheriff. This is Tucker Bodine at the Bodine Ranch. Someone's breaking into my house. Units are on the way. Stay in your room and keep the door locked. Tucker ended the call and eased the bedroom door open. The hallway was dark. He could see light moving downstairs, flashlight beams, hear voices speaking quietly. They were in Roy's study. He moved down the hallway, staying low. The stairs creaked, but the intruders were making enough noise they didn't hear. Tucker reached the ground floor and pressed against the wall. From here, he could see into the study. 3 figures in dark clothes and ski masks going through the filing cabinets, pulling out Roy's notebooks, the photocopied documents, everything Tucker and Grace had found. One of them spoke. Make sure you get everything. All the notebooks, all the files. Boss wants nothing left. Tucker stepped into the doorway. Sheriff's on the way. The 3 men froze, then one of them moved toward Tucker. He was big, muscular, and he had a crowbar in his hand. Smart move would be, walk away, the man said. Forget you saw us. Not happening. The man swung the crowbar. Tucker ducked and drove his shoulder into the attacker's midsection. Years of Army combatives training taking over. They went down hard, crashing into the desk. The other 2 men grabbed document boxes and ran. Tucker heard the back door slam, an engine start, tires on gravel. The man under Tucker threw a wild punch that caught him on the cheek. They rolled, grappling. Tucker got an arm lock and held it until he heard sirens approaching. The intruder went limp, giving up. Sheriff Pruitt was the first one through the door, weapon drawn. He took in the scene quickly. Tucker bleeding from a cut over his eye, the intruder on the floor, the study ransacked. Let him up. Tucker released the arm lock and stood. The intruder got to his feet. Pruitt pulled off the ski mask. The man was maybe 40, local from the looks of him, scared now that the law was here. Gary Mitchell, Pruitt said flatly. What the hell are you doing? I was hired for a job, that's all. Hired by who? Mitchell looked at the floor. Can't say, they'll kill me. Pruitt cuffed him and put him in the patrol car, then came back inside. You all right? I've been worse. I'll need a statement, and we should photograph the scene. Tucker looked around the study. The filing cabinets were open, contents scattered. But he noticed something. They didn't take everything. Some of the notebooks are still here. They were interrupted, Pruitt said. You got lucky. Another deputy arrived, then another. They processed the scene, took photos, bagged evidence. Tucker gave his statement, sitting at the kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas pressed to his eye. Grace showed up an hour later, called by one of Pruitt's deputies who knew she'd been researching with Tucker. They came for the evidence, she said, looking at the ransacked study. Some of it, Tucker replied, not all. Pruitt pulled them aside before he left. This was a warning. Next time might be worse. You should seriously consider Senator Carlisle's offer and walk away. Is that advice or a threat? It's reality. Someone is scared enough of what you might find to commit felony burglary. That kind of scared is dangerous. After the deputies left, Tucker and Grace inventoried what remained. The intruders had taken maybe half of Roy's notebooks and most of the photocopied documents from the locked drawer. But they'd missed things. Some notebooks had fallen behind the filing cabinet. The photograph of the 5 conspirators was in Tucker's pocket, safe. And most importantly, they hadn't touched the storm shelter, because they couldn't open it without Tucker. And if Tucker opened it, he'd lose his inheritance anyway. They're not just trying to stop us, Grace said. They're trying to destroy the evidence before we can use it. Tucker's phone rang. Senator Carlisle. Mr. Bodine, I heard about the break-in at your ranch. Terrible thing. Rural crime is a serious problem these days. You know who did it. I know that you're making some people very nervous with your questions and meetings. I know that continued investigation into 70-year-old business matters would be unhealthy for everyone involved. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. I'm prepared to raise my offer. $3 million, cash, quick close. You walk away from this crusade and start a new life with money to set you up for decades. And if I don't, then I can't guarantee your safety. Can't guarantee that the evidence you think you have will survive. Can't guarantee anything except that you'll regret not taking this deal. Tucker looked at Grace, at the ransacked study, at the broken window and scattered papers. Thought about Martha Yates and Robert Chen and Edwin Cross. Thought about 18 families and stolen land and debts that couldn't be paid. No deal, he said. I'm opening that shelter on Saturday. If you want to stop me, you'll have to kill me. He hung up. Grace was staring at him. That was incredibly stupid or incredibly brave. Probably both. They worked through the rest of the night, documenting everything that remained, uploading photographs and scans to cloud storage, sending copies to 3 different email accounts. By dawn, they had a record of everything the burglars hadn't taken. Not complete, but something. Tucker made coffee and they sat on the front porch watching the sun rise over the prairie. Saturday was 2 days away. 2 days until he opened that shelter and found out if Roy had left enough evidence to prove conspiracy. 2 days until he forfeited his inheritance and learned if justice was possible or if he'd just destroyed his future for nothing. You should know, Grace said quietly, that if we do this, if we expose what happened, it won't be clean. Current property owners will fight to keep their land. Lawyers will argue statute of limitations and good faith purchase and economic disruption. It could take years to sort out. I know. And you might end up with nothing. No money, no land, no guarantee of success. I know that too. Then why? Tucker thought about his grandfather's photograph, about 70 years of silence, about Martha's father's letters from Korea promising to fix things he couldn't fix, about all the men who'd come home from war to find their lives stolen. Because someone has to, he'd said. Because Roy couldn't and I can. Because if I don't, I'm just another link in a chain of people who chose comfort over conscience. Grace nodded. Didn't argue, understood. Saturday was coming. The truth was sealed in concrete and steel behind his grandfather's barn. And Tucker Bodine, former Army Ranger, construction worker, grandson of a conspirator, was going to open that door and face whatever Roy had left behind, even if it cost him everything. Friday morning brought clouds heavy with the promise of late winter snow. 3 months had passed since Roy's funeral in November. 3 months of Tucker living in limbo between Omaha construction work and Nebraska inheritance questions. Now, in late February, decisions could no longer be delayed. Tucker sat in the office of a public defender named Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a desk buried under case files. She listened to his situation while taking notes on a yellow legal pad. The injunction Senator Carlisle filed is legitimate, she said after he finished. Historical preservation and public safety are valid grounds for restricting access to a structure. Fighting it would require proving the injunction was filed in bad faith, which is nearly impossible to demonstrate. Even though it's obvious bad faith, obvious to us maybe, but proving it in court requires evidence of Carlisle's actual motivation. You'd need documentation showing he filed specifically to prevent you from accessing evidence. Without that, it's just your word against the state senators. Tucker leaned back in his chair. How long would the legal process take? 6 to 8 months minimum. Appeals could stretch it to a year or more. And that's if you can afford the filing fees and legal representation, which I can't. Martinez set down her pen. Mr. Bodine, I handle a lot of cases for people who can't afford private attorneys. I see good people trapped by legal systems designed to favor those with money and power. Senator Carlisle has both. You have neither. If you fight this through official channels, you'll lose. Not because you're wrong, but because the system isn't built for fairness. So I do nothing? I'm saying the legal road is a dead end. If you want access to that shelter, you'll have to find another way. Off the record, of course, I never suggested anything illegal. Tucker left her office with the clarity that comes from having options removed. The legal system wouldn't help him. The sheriff had warned him about consequences. Senator Carlisle had made threats. Grace's research proved patterns, but not conspiracy. Everything pointed to the storm shelter and the evidence Roy had sealed inside. Evidence Tucker couldn't legally access without forfeiting his inheritance. He drove to the ranch through countryside still brown from winter, but showing hints of coming spring. The cattle were clustered near windbreaks, instinct telling them the season was turning. Tucker parked by the house and walked to the shelter. Stood in front of that steel door, running calculations in his head. This weekend, he'd decided. Tomorrow night, late February, give himself one more day to prepare, to think, to make peace with what he was about to lose. His phone rang. Jennifer, I got the money for Melissa's glasses. Thank you. How is she? Good. She asks about you, wants to know when you're coming back. Soon. I've got some things to sort out here first. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Tucker, I heard from my cousin in Broken Bow. She says you're stirring up trouble out there. Something about old foreclosures and Senator Carlisle. It's complicated. It's always complicated with you. Look, I don't care what you do with your inheritance, but Melissa needs stability. She needs a father who's present and reliable, not someone chasing ghosts and picking fights with powerful people. These aren't ghosts, they're real families who lost everything. 70 years ago, ancient history. You can't fix the past. Maybe not, but I can tell the truth about it. At what cost? That inheritance could have helped with Melissa's future. College fund, medical expenses, all of it. Instead, you're going to throw it away for people you never met. Tucker looked at the shelter. Yeah, I think I am. Jennifer sighed. I hope it's worth it. For Melissa's sake, I hope whatever you're doing is worth losing everything for. The line went dead. Tucker put his phone away and walked the fence line, checking gates and water tanks, doing the ranch work Roy had done for decades. The physical labor helped clear his mind. By afternoon, he'd worked up a sweat despite the cold. Went inside, showered, made coffee. Grace arrived around 4 with her laptop and more research files. They spread everything across Roy's kitchen table. Documents, photographs, timelines, evidence of pattern and practice. Everything except proof of coordination. I've been thinking about the second vault, Grace said. Tucker looked up. What second vault? You said Senator Carlisle mentioned disposing of the shelter contents properly. What if Roy didn't put everything in one place? What if he hedged his bets? Where else would he hide evidence? Grace pulled up property records on her laptop. The old community bank building in Broken Bow, closed in 1987. Roy worked there as a surveyor, had access to the vaults. What if he hid something there? After 70 years, the building's been abandoned for decades. Exactly. Nobody would think to look there. Grace showed him photographs of the building. It's still standing, mostly empty. The vaults are in the basement. I looked into it once but couldn't get access without permission from the current owner. Who owns it? County Historical Society. Which means if you forfeit your inheritance, technically I could authorize access. Tucker saw the logic immediately. If there's a second cache of evidence, we need it before opening the shelter. Once I forfeit the inheritance, you'll have authority to get into that bank vault. It's a long shot. Everything about this is a long shot. They spent the evening planning. Saturday night for the shelter, late February darkness coming early this time of year. But first tonight they try the bank building. If there was nothing there, fine. But if Roy had been thorough enough to hide backup evidence, they needed to find it before Carlisle's people could destroy it. At 9 o'clock, Sheriff Pruitt's truck pulled into the driveway. Tucker tensed, wondering if this was an arrest. But Pruitt got out alone, no backup, no official vehicle markings. He looked older in the porch light, worn down by something heavier than age. Can we talk? Pruitt asked. They sat in the living room. Grace made coffee, nobody drank. Pruitt took off his hat and set it on the coffee table with the careful precision of a man buying time to find words. I couldn't sleep last night, he said finally. Kept thinking about my son. He deployed to Afghanistan 3 months ago. Marine Corps second tour. Every night I wonder if he's safe, if he'll come home, if something will happen to him over there. Tucker nodded. I did 2 tours. I know what it's like. Then you know what it's like for the families too. The waiting, the fear. My wife barely sleeps. She jumps every time a car pulls up to the house, terrified it's notification officers. Pruitt's hands were shaking slightly. If something happened to my boy while he was deployed, if someone took advantage of that, stole from us, hurt his family while he was serving his country, I'd want justice. I'd want someone to stand up and do the right thing. Sir, why are you telling me this? Because my grandfather did exactly that. Took advantage of deployed servicemen, stole their land while they were fighting in Korea, built everything my family has on that theft. And I've known it my whole life, known it and stayed silent because it was easier than facing it. Grace leaned forward. Sheriff, are you saying you'll help us? I'm saying I can't officially help. I'm compromised by family connection. But unofficially, I can give you information. I can tell you that Senator Carlisle has hired private security to watch your property starting tomorrow. 6 men armed with orders to prevent anyone from accessing the shelter. I can tell you they'll be here by 6 a.m. Saturday. That's 12 hours from now, Tucker said, which gives you tonight if you're planning to do something foolish. I can also tell you that there's a second location you should check. Old Community Bank Building. My grandfather mentioned it once when I was a kid, said Roy Bodine had access to Vault 7 in the basement. Always wondered what that meant. Grace looked at Tucker. Vault 7. How do we get in? Tucker asked. Pruitt pulled a keyring from his pocket, set it on the table. Building's been county property for 20 years. Sheriff's office has master keys for emergencies. This would technically be theft of county property, which I'd be obligated to investigate. But if the keys went missing for a few hours and then mysteriously reappeared, well, rural crime is hard to solve. Tucker picked up the keys. Why now? Why help us now? Because I have a son in a war zone and I finally understand what those families felt. Because I'm tired of protecting a legacy built on shame. Because I want to be able to look my boy in the eye when he comes home and know I did something right. Prewitt stood. I'll report those keys missing tomorrow morning. You'll have until then. He walked to the door, paused. One more thing. Roy left a letter with my father before he died. My father gave it to me last year, said I'd know when to pass it on. It's addressed to you. Prewitt handed Tucker an envelope, yellowed with age. Then he left, his truck disappearing into the darkness. Tucker opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single page in Roy's handwriting, dated 3 months before his death. Tucker, if you're reading this, you've met Dale Prewitt, and he's decided to help you. Good. Dale's a better man than his grandfather. Better than me, probably. I couldn't make things right in my lifetime. Lived too long as a coward. But I left you tools to be braver than I was. Vault 7 in the old community bank basement. Combination is 1845-12. The relief fund money is still there. $2.3 million in bonds, supposed to go to the families we displaced. Never distributed. Physical proof of embezzlement and fraud. Take it to them. Make it right. The shelter has the documents. The bank has the money. Together, it's everything you need. Sorry I couldn't do this myself. Proud of you for being strong enough. Roy. Grace was reading over his shoulder. $2.3 million in relief fund money. Never distributed. That's criminal embezzlement on top of the foreclosure conspiracy. And it's been sitting in a bank vault for 70 years. They loaded bolt cutters, flashlights, and a camera into Tucker's truck. The drive to Broken Bow took 20 minutes through darkness, so complete it felt like driving through the bottom of the ocean. Main Street was empty, businesses closed, street lights casting pools of yellow on empty pavement. The old community bank building stood on a corner lot. 3 stories of brick and limestone, windows dark and boarded. Tucker parked in the alley behind the building. The rear entrance was secured with a padlock that Prewitt's key opened easily. They slipped inside, flashlights cutting through decades of dust and abandonment. The lobby was frozen in time, teller windows still in place, old posters on the walls advertising savings accounts and mortgage rates from the 1980s. Grace found the stairs to the basement. They descended into darkness that smelled of mold and concrete. The basement was a maze of small rooms and corridors, storage areas, mechanical spaces, and at the far end, the vault room. 7 individual vaults set into the concrete wall, each with a combination lock and a brass plate showing its number. Vault 7 was on the bottom right. Tucker tried the combination from Roy's letter, 1845-12. The lock mechanism resisted at first, decades of disuse making it stiff. Then something clicked and the handle turned. The vault door swung open with a groan of old metal. Inside was a metal box about the size of a briefcase. Tucker lifted it out carefully. The box was heavy, solid. He set it on the floor and opened the lid. Bonds. Stacks of government bonds in denominations of $1,000, carefully organized in folders. Tucker counted quickly. 230 bonds, face value $230,000 in 1954 money. With 70 years of accumulated interest, Grace calculated on her phone, they were worth approximately $8.2 million today. This is the relief fund, Grace breathed, the money that was supposed to be distributed to the displaced families. They collected it from selling the stolen properties, supposedly to help the families relocate, but they kept it. Under the bonds was a ledger, Roy's handwriting documenting every property sale, every dollar collected, every family that should have received compensation. 18 names, 18 amounts, 0 distributions. At the bottom of the ledger, a note in Roy's hand. Agreed to distribute relief fund to families. Judge Carlisle, Sheriff Prewitt, Banker Mason voted to keep it instead. I objected, was outvoted 3-1. Developer Hayes abstained. We divided the bonds, planning to cash them after statute of limitations expired. I took my share but couldn't cash them. Returned them to this vault in 1962, waiting for someone brave enough to make it right. R.B. Tucker felt something cold settle in his stomach. Roy hadn't just participated in the conspiracy, He'd been complicit in the embezzlement too, had taken his share of the stolen relief fund, held on to it for 8 years, then hidden it away out of guilt he couldn't overcome enough to actually return it. He tried, Grace said quietly, reading the same passage. Not hard enough, but he tried. More than the others did. They photographed everything, the bonds, the ledger, Roy's notes, uploaded the images to cloud storage on Grace's phone. Then Tucker made a decision. He loaded the metal box into his truck. This money belonged to 18 families. If they were going to expose the conspiracy, the families deserved their compensation. Back at the ranch, they hid the metal box in the barn under hay bales, sat in the kitchen drinking coffee while adrenaline slowly faded. It was past midnight. Saturday had arrived, late February turning toward March. In 18 hours, Carlisle's security team would be watching the shelter. But they had tonight. We should do it now, Tucker said. Open the shelter tonight before they can stop us. You'll forfeit everything the moment you break that seal. I know. Grace looked at him for a long moment. You're sure? I'm sure. They gathered tools from Roy's workshop. Bolt cutters for the chain, a heavy pry bar for the padlock, flashlights, the camera. Walked through the dark to the hillside behind the barn. The late February night was cold but clear, stars brilliant overhead. The storm shelter waited, exactly as it had for 70 years. Tucker put his hand on the steel door one last time. Once I cut this chain, there's no going back. I know. Tucker positioned the bolt cutters on the chain. The metal was thick, resistant. He squeezed with all his strength and felt something give. The chain parted with a snap that echoed across the prairie. He let it fall to the ground. The padlock was newer, maintained by Roy over the decades. Tucker worked it with the pry bar, leveraging against the steel door frame. 5 minutes of effort, and the lock mechanism shattered. The padlock fell away. Tucker gripped the door handle. This was it. The moment Roy had prevented for 70 years. The moment that would cost Tucker his inheritance and possibly reveal nothing useful. Or possibly change everything. He pulled the door open. Air rushed out, stale and dry, preserved since 1954. Tucker shined his flashlight inside. Concrete steps descended into darkness. He started down with Grace right behind him. 12 steps to a small landing. Then a steel door, this one unlocked. He pushed it open. The shelter was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, lined with metal shelves. Everything was covered in dust, but otherwise perfectly preserved. The dry prairie air had protected it all. Tucker's flashlight beam moved across the shelves, revealing what Roy had hidden. Shelf 1 held filing boxes, each labeled with a year, 1952, 53, 54. Tucker opened the first box. Inside were property files for 18 ranches. Original documents showing mortgage status, payment histories, ownership records. Everything proving the ranches had been financially stable before foreclosure. Shelf 2 contained bank memos, internal communications from First County Bank discussing target properties and timeline coordination. One memo made Tucker's blood run cold. It was dated March 1952, written by banker Howard Mason to Judge Walter Carlisle. Per our discussion, I've identified 18 properties suitable for acquisition. All have servicemen scheduled for Korea deployment between April and September. Recommend initiating foreclosure proceedings within 30 days of deployment. Attached timeline ensures minimal resistance and maximum efficiency. Estimated total acquisition cost, $460,000. Estimated market value, $2.8 million. Profit margin sufficient to justify relief fund establishment as cover. They planned it, Grace whispered. Months in advance, identified properties based on deployment schedules. Shelf 3 held legal documents. Foreclosure orders signed by Judge Carlisle, each rubber stamped with approval dates that showed impossible speed. Properties foreclosed in days instead of months. Court hearings held in private without notification to the affected families. Everything technically legal, but morally bankrupt. Shelf 4 was photographs. Roy had documented everything. Families being evicted, children crying on porches, personal belongings piled in yards. Images of the conspirators meeting at a country club, raising glasses in celebration. One photograph showed the 5 men standing over a table covered with property deeds, literally dividing up the stolen land. And Shelf 5, the evidence that changed everything. A reel-to-reel tape recorder sat on the shelf, carefully maintained, with a note attached. Play this first. Tucker found a power outlet, plugged in the recorder, threaded the tape, pressed play. Roy's voice filled the concrete room, younger than Tucker remembered but carrying the same quiet intensity. This is Roy Bodine recording on August 10th, 1954. What I'm about to document is a confession and a testimony. Judge Walter Carlisle, Sheriff Frank Pruitt, banker Howard Mason, developer Kenneth Hayes and myself met on March 14th, 1952, to discuss opportunities created by the Korean War deployment schedule. Judge Carlisle proposed that we coordinate acquisition of properties belonging to servicemen who would be deployed and unable to defend their land rights. The tape continued, Roy's voice methodical and damning. He described the planning meetings, the division of responsibilities, the legal mechanisms they'd exploited. Judge Carlisle would fast-track foreclosures. Sheriff Pruitt would conduct evictions and suppress complaints. Banker Mason would identify vulnerable properties and initiate proceedings. Developer Hayes would purchase properties through shell companies. And Roy would survey and document transfers, legitimizing the theft with official paperwork. We told ourselves it was business, Roy's voice said. Legal business. But we knew what we were doing. We were stealing from men who were serving their country. We timed foreclosures to happen while soldiers were overseas and couldn't defend themselves. We violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act knowingly and deliberately. We destroyed 18 families for profit. Grace was crying silently, filming the tape recorder with her phone. Tucker listened to his grandfather confess to crimes that had shaped 3 generations. The relief fund was supposed to be our cover, Roy continued. We'd collect proceeds from property sales, claim we were establishing a fund to help the displaced families relocate and resettle, make it look charitable. But we never distributed a penny. We kept it all. $2.3 million divided between us with the intention of cashing the bonds after the statute of limitations expired. The tape ran for 40 minutes. Roy documented every meeting, every decision, every family targeted. Named names, provided dates, described the mechanics of the conspiracy in detail that could never be explained away or denied. Near the end, his voice changed, became heavier. I've lived with this for 25 years now. Can't sleep most nights. Can't look at my son without thinking about the sons I helped steal from. Can't stand at my property line without remembering the 18 families I helped displace. Judge Carlisle, Sheriff Pruitt, Banker Mason, they sleep fine. They've convinced themselves it was legal. Therefore it was right, but I know better. I know what we did was evil. Roy's voice cracked slightly. I'm sealing this shelter today, putting all the evidence inside, the documents, the photographs, the financial records, this confession. Someday, maybe someone will have the courage I lack. Someone will open this door and expose what we did. Give the families justice. Give me a clean conscience, even if it's posthumous. Until then, may God forgive me, because I can't forgive myself. The tape ended with a click. Silence filled the concrete room. Tucker stood there processing what he'd just heard. His grandfather's full confession. Recorded testimony that would stand up in any court. Evidence of conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. Everything Grace had spent 10 years trying to prove, delivered in Roy's own voice. Grace was still filming, tears running down her face. We have it. We actually have everything. Tucker moved to the last shelf, found one more item, a letter addressed to him in Roy's handwriting. Recent, dated just weeks before Roy died. Tucker, if you've opened this shelter, you've heard my confession. You know what I did. You know what kind of man I was. I'm sorry I couldn't be better. Sorry I couldn't make this right while I was alive. But I'm proud you had the strength I lacked. Everything in this shelter is yours to use. Take it to federal authorities. Take it to the families. Make them acknowledge what happened. Make them pay back what was stolen. I've attached documentation showing where each conspirator's descendants are today. Senator Raymond Carlisle controls the Carlisle Land Company. Dale Pruitt is county sheriff. Mason's grandson runs Mason Development in Lincoln. Hayes' daughter sold her holdings in 1985, made restitution to one family before she died. She was the only one with a conscience. The others have lived comfortably on stolen wealth for 7 decades. End that, please, Roy. Tucker looked at Grace. We need to get out of here and upload everything before they can stop us. They worked quickly, photographing every document, every photograph. recording video of the entire shelter contents. Loaded the most critical items into boxes to take with them. The tape recording, the original bank memos, the foreclosure documents with Judge Carlisle's signatures. By 2 in the morning, they had everything documented and packed. As they climbed the steps back to ground level, Tucker heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Multiple engines. Headlights appeared on the ranch road, coming fast. They know, Grace said. Someone told them. Tucker counted at least 3 trucks pulling into his driveway. Men getting out. In the darkness, he could see them carrying rifles. Carlisle had sent his security team early, or maybe someone had been watching and called them the moment the shelter opened. We need to run, Grace said. But there was nowhere to run. The trucks blocked the driveway. Men were spreading out, moving toward the shelter. Tucker made a decision. He grabbed Grace's phone and the metal box containing the most critical documents. Get in the barn. Upload everything from there. I'll hold them off. Tucker, they'll arrest you, or worse. Just upload it. Get it public. That's all that matters. Grace ran for the barn. Tucker stood at the shelter entrance as the men approached. 6 of them, all armed, all professional. Private security contractors, probably ex-military. They stopped 10 feet away. The lead man spoke. Mr. Bodine, step away from the structure. You're trespassing on county property. This is my ranch. Not anymore. The moment you opened that shelter, you violated the terms of your grandfather's will. The property reverted to the Historical Society. You're trespassing. A black SUV pulled up behind the trucks. Senator Raymond Carlisle stepped out, dressed casually but still carrying authority like a tailored suit. He walked up to the shelter entrance and looked at Tucker with an expression of disappointment. You made a very poor choice tonight. I made the right choice. Right for who? Not for yourself. You've just forfeited $2 million and 800 acres of land. For what? Old documents about events nobody cares about anymore. 18 families care. Their descendants care. Justice cares. Carlisle laughed without humor. Justice? You think this is about justice? This is about property rights and legal precedent and economic stability. You open this Pandora's box, you don't just hurt me. You hurt every current property owner in this county. People who bought land in good faith decades ago. You want to tell them their titles are void? Their property values are destroyed? That they're living on stolen land? They are living on stolen land. Legally acquired land. Yes, the process was rushed. Yes, the timing was opportunistic. But it was legal. Foreclosures happened. Judges approved them. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. Tucker shook his head. The Service Member Civil Relief Act made those foreclosures illegal. Federal law trumps local process. Every one of those transfers was void from the start. Prove it. In court, 70 years later, with statute of limitations long expired. You'll spend years in litigation and end up with nothing. I have my grandfather's confession on tape. I have bank memos planning the conspiracy. I have Judge Carlisle's signatures on fraudulent foreclosure orders. I have documentation of embezzled relief funds. I have everything. For the first time, and Carlisle's composure cracked, you have nothing that will hold up in court. That tape is hearsay. Those documents are old photocopies. Any good lawyer will get them excluded as evidence. Then you have nothing to worry about. Carlisle stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen to me carefully. I'm offering you one last chance. Walk away right now. Forget what you found in that shelter. In exchange, I'll arrange for the Historical Society to transfer the property back to you. The inheritance will be restored. You'll get your money and your land. All you have to do is keep quiet. And the 18 families get nothing. The 18 families are mostly dead. The few descendants who remain don't need money. They need closure. Give them an apology, a memorial, some symbolic gesture. They'll accept it and move on. Tucker thought about Martha Yates's father's letters from Korea, about Robert Chen's grandfather working construction for 40 years after losing his ranch, about Edwin Cross's grandmother dying 6 months after losing her home, about all the broken promises and destroyed families. No deal. The truth matters more than money. Carlisle's expression hardened. Then you're a fool. Security. Remove him from the property. 2 men moved toward Tucker. He tensed, ready to fight, when sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights appeared on the ranch road. Sheriff Pruitt's vehicle, followed by 2 state police cars. Pruitt got out and walked up to the gathering. Looked at Carlisle, then at Tucker, then at the open shelter. Senator, I'm going to need you and your men to leave this property. Sheriff, this man is trespassing. The property belongs to the County Historical Society as of 2 hours ago when he violated the will provisions. That's a civil matter for the courts to decide. Right now, I have reason to believe evidence of federal crimes is located in this structure. I've contacted the FBI field office in Omaha. They're sending agents to secure the scene. Nobody touches anything until they arrive. Carlisle's face went white. On what grounds? Violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement of federal funds. I have sworn testimony from Mr. Bodine regarding the contents of this shelter. That's sufficient probable cause. This is harassment. I'll have your badge. You're welcome to try. Sir, you and your men need to leave now. Carlisle stared at Pruitt for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his SUV. His security team followed. The vehicles pulled away, leaving Tucker and Pruitt standing in the darkness. The FBI really coming? Tucker asked. They will be by morning. I called in favors. Made it clear this was time sensitive. Pruitt looked at the open shelter. Did you find what you needed? Everything. Roy documented it all. Good. Then maybe this ends the way it should have 70 years ago. Grace emerged from the barn. It's uploaded, everything. Cloud storage, email, sent to 3 different journalists and the FBI field office directly. Even if they destroy the physical evidence now, it's too late. Tucker felt something release in his chest. Relief maybe, or just exhaustion. They'd done it. Opened the shelter, found the evidence, preserved it, made it public. Roy's 70-year secret was finally exposed. Dawn came cold and gray. FBI agents arrived at 7, 3 of them in dark suits and serious expressions. They secured the shelter, documented the contents, took Tucker's statement. By noon, news crews were setting up on the road outside the property. By evening, the story had gone national. Tucker sat on Roy's porch watching reporters do live shots with the ranch as backdrop. His phone had been ringing constantly. Lawyers, journalists, family members of the displaced families all wanting to talk. He'd turned it off hours ago. Grace sat beside him. How do you feel? Broke, homeless, unemployed. Tucker managed a slight smile, but lighter somehow, like I set down something heavy I didn't know I was carrying. Roy's guilt. Maybe, or my own, I don't know anymore. A car pulled up. Martha Yates got out, moving slowly but with purpose. She walked up to the porch and looked at Tucker for a long moment. I heard what you did, what you gave up. It was the right thing. My father would have liked you. He'd have said you were a man of honor. Her eyes were wet. Thank you for giving us the truth, for proving it wasn't his fault. She handed Tucker an envelope and walked back to her car. Inside was a check, $300. A note in shaky handwriting said simply, "For your daughter's glasses, from the Yates family with gratitude." Tucker sat there holding the check while the sun set behind clouds heavy with the promise of March snow. He'd lost $2 million and 800 acres of land. He'd lost his inheritance and his future security. But 18 families finally had proof they'd been wronged. Finally had acknowledgement that their losses weren't failures, but thefts. Finally had the truth Roy couldn't give them while he was alive. The first snowflakes began to fall as darkness came. Tucker and Grace sat on the porch in silence, watching the prairie turn white. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and legal battles and complications neither of them could predict. But tonight the truth was finally free. And that had to be worth something. The FBI field office in Omaha sent 3 agents initially, then 6 more by Monday morning. They set up a command post in the Broken Bow courthouse, requisitioned office space, and began the methodical work of building a federal case 70 years after the crimes occurred. Special Agent Sarah Vance was lead investigator, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades untangling white-collar crime. She interviewed Tucker for 6 hours on Sunday, going through every document, every photograph, every minute of Roy's confession tape. Your grandfather's testimony is compelling, she said, making notes on a yellow legal pad. But it's also self-serving, a dead man confessing to crimes when there's no possibility of prosecution. Defense attorneys will argue it's unreliable. There are corroborating documents, bank memos, foreclosure orders, financial records, which we'll need to authenticate, prove chain of custody, demonstrate they haven't been tampered with over 7 decades. Vance looked up from her notes. Mr. Bodine, I want to be clear about something. What your grandfather documented is important. It's evidence of systematic civil rights violations and fraud. But it's not a slam dunk case. The people responsible are dead, their descendants didn't commit these crimes, and there are significant legal hurdles to overcome. Tucker felt something cold in his chest. You're saying nothing will happen. I'm saying justice is complicated. We'll investigate thoroughly. We'll present findings to the U.S. attorney. But you should prepare for the possibility that criminal charges may not be viable after this much time. And the families, the people who lost everything, civil claims are separate. They can sue for restitution, but again, statute of limitations, death of original parties, current property owners who bought in good faith, these are all obstacles. Tucker left the courthouse feeling like he'd traded his inheritance for nothing. Grace was waiting in her truck, laptop open, monitoring news coverage. The story had exploded over the weekend. National outlets were running features about the Nebraska land theft conspiracy. Veteran organizations were calling for investigations. Legal experts were debating whether 70-year-old crimes could be prosecuted. The families are getting calls from lawyers, Grace said, class action firms wanting to represent them. Some are excited, others are scared. Scared of what? Retaliation, loss of community support, making things worse instead of better. She showed him her screen, local news coverage from Broken Bow. The headline read, "Controversial Shelter Opening Divides County." Tucker read the article. It quoted current property owners expressing fear about title validity, business leaders worried about economic impact, county commissioners calling for calm and caution, and Senator Carlisle interviewed on the courthouse steps, looking dignified and wronged. "This is a tragic situation," Carlisle was quoted saying. "My grandfather made mistakes 70 years ago. I acknowledge that. But punishing current innocent property owners for historical injustices helps no one. We need reconciliation, not revenge." "He's spinning it," Grace said, making himself the victim. Tucker's phone rang. Clayton Hughes, the estate attorney. "Mr. Bodine, we need to discuss your legal status. The Historical Society is claiming ownership of the ranch property based on the will clause you violated. However, given the circumstances and public attention, they're willing to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" "A settlement. You acknowledge the property belongs to them. They agree not to pursue trespassing charges, and they'll work with you on a transition timeline. You'd have 60 days to remove personal items. And if I don't agree, they'll file eviction proceedings. You'll be removed by the sheriff and banned from the property. Mr. Bodine, you have no legal standing here. The moment you open that shelter, you forfeited all rights." Tucker ended the call, looked at the ranch house where he'd spent summers as a child, the barn where Roy had taught him to work cattle, the land that had been in his family for 100 years, all of it gone because he'd chosen truth over inheritance. Grace put a hand on his arm. "You did the right thing. Doesn't feel like it." Over the next week, Tucker learned what choosing truth actually cost. His construction job called to say they were letting him go, budget cuts, nothing personal. His apartment complex in Omaha sent an eviction notice, 3 months behind on rent. Jennifer called to say Melissa was getting bullied at school because kids had seen her father on the news, the man who destroyed the county economy. Tucker's bank account held $200 and falling. He moved into the ranch house while he still could, sleeping in Roy's bed, eating canned food from the pantry. Grace brought groceries she couldn't afford. Sheriff Pruitt stopped by to warn him that Carlisle's lawyers were preparing a defamation lawsuit. The FBI agents packed up their command post and returned to Omaha, investigation ongoing but no timeline for resolution. On Thursday, a letter arrived from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tucker opened it with shaking hands. The language was formal and dense, but the message was clear. After reviewing the evidence, the office had determined that while the documented activities appeared to violate federal law, the passage of time and death of the principals made criminal prosecution impractical. The case was being referred to the Civil Rights Division for further review, but no charges would be filed. Tucker sat on the porch holding the letter while snow fell across the prairie. He'd given up everything for justice, and justice had politely declined to show up. Grace arrived an hour later, read the letter, sat beside him in silence for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "So am I. The civil case is still active. 18 families are suing the Carlisle estate and current property holders. That might get them compensation. Might, after years of litigation they can't afford. Tucker, you did something important. You exposed the truth. You gave those families acknowledgement. That matters." "Does it?" Martha Yates is 78 years old. Robert Chen is 65. Edwin Cross is 71. How many of them will live to see any kind of justice? How many will die still waiting like their parents did? He stood and walked to the edge of the porch. The ranch stretched out in all directions, white with new snow, beautiful and empty, and no longer his. I traded $2 million for a letter saying nobody will be held accountable. I made my daughter's life harder. I lost my job and my home. And for what? So the FBI could politely pass on prosecution? Grace stood beside him. You broke 70 years of silence. That's not nothing. It feels like nothing. That night, Tucker couldn't sleep. Lay in Roy's bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about choices and consequences and the price of doing right. At 2 in the morning, he got up and walked to Roy's study. The FBI had returned most of the documents after photographing them. Tucker pulled out his grandfather's notebooks, reading the margin notes by lamplight. Johnson family, evicted in 48 hours. I watched them cry. Peterson Ranch, sheriff threatened physical force. I said nothing. McCall property, children begging to stay. I finished my survey and left. Roy had documented his own cowardice in careful detail. Had spent 70 years living with choices he couldn't undo. Tucker understood that weight now. Understood what it meant to make a choice and have to live with the consequences forever. Friday morning brought more news. The Historical Society filed eviction papers. Tucker had 30 days to vacate. Senator Carlisle announced a community healing initiative offering to fund a memorial for the displaced families and establish a scholarship program. The offer was generous and calculated, making him look magnanimous while admitting no wrongdoing. Tucker drove to town for supplies and found himself the subject of stares and whispers. The hardware store owner was friendly but distant. The grocery clerk rang up his items without making eye contact. At the diner, conversation stopped when he entered. He ate lunch alone in a booth while the whole room pretended he wasn't there. On his way out, an old man stopped him. Tucker recognized him from Martha Yates's photographs. Her brother, Daniel Jr., named for his father. Want you to know some of us appreciate what you did, the old man said quietly. My father died thinking he was a failure. You proved he wasn't. That's worth something to the family. Thank you. But you should also know, a lot of folks in this town think you're a troublemaker. Think you destroyed property values and stirred up old pain for no good reason. They won't say it to your face, but they're hoping you leave soon. Tucker drove back to the ranch feeling the full weight of isolation. He'd chosen truth, and truth had made him an outcast. The families he tried to help appreciated it, but they were few. The community that benefited from the conspiracy, even unknowingly, resented him. That evening, Grace arrived with the news. The class action lawsuit is moving forward. Judge assigned to the case is from outside the county, which is good. First hearing is in 2 weeks. The family's attorney thinks there's a real chance of settlement. What kind of settlement? Monetary compensation. Maybe 5 to 10 million split between 18 families. Not full restitution, but something. And possibly title transfers for a few properties where current owners are willing to negotiate. Tucker did the math. 10 million divided by 18 families was about $550,000 each. Less than the land was worth, but more than they'd had for 70 years. Not justice, but acknowledgement with a price tag attached. There's something else, Grace said. The attorney wants to depose you. You're a key witness. Your testimony about finding the evidence, Roy's confession, all of it. When? Next week, Tuesday in Lincoln. Tucker spent the weekend preparing. Reviewed all the documents, practiced answering questions, tried to remember every detail of opening the shelter. Sunday evening, Sheriff Pruitt stopped by with unexpected news. Senator Carlisle wants to meet with you. Private conversation, no lawyers, no recording. He says he has an offer. I'm not interested in his offers. Hear him out, please. I think he's genuinely trying to find a way forward. Tucker agreed reluctantly. They met Monday morning at a rest stop halfway to Lincoln, neutral ground. Carlisle arrived alone in an unmarked sedan. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, the stress showing in new lines around his eyes. They sat at a picnic table in the cold. Carlisle got straight to business. The class action lawsuit is going to succeed. My lawyers have reviewed the evidence, and they're advising settlement. The documents your grandfather preserved prove conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt in civil court. We'll lose. Good. Maybe. Maybe not. Here's what a loss looks like. My family's assets get seized to pay damages. The Carlisle Land Company is liquidated. 45,000 acres of productive ranch land gets sold off piecemeal to pay legal judgments. I lose everything my family built over 3 generations. Not just the stolen land, all of it, because it's all interconnected financially. Tucker felt no sympathy. You built it on theft. My grandfather built it on theft. I was born into it. Grew up thinking we were respectable ranchers. Didn't learn the truth until I was in my 30s. By then, what was I supposed to do? Confess to crimes I didn't commit? Destroy my own children's inheritance? Yes, that's exactly what you should have done. Carlisle was quiet for a moment. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should have exposed it years ago. But I didn't. I protected the family legacy, and now it's going to be destroyed anyway. Just in the worst possible way. Why are you telling me this? Because I want to propose a settlement before the lawsuit proceeds. Before this gets dragged through courts for years, I'll offer $15 million to the 18 families, distributed equally based on Roy's documentation of who should have received the relief fund. I'll also transfer back 5 properties to families who want to return to ranching. The remaining land stays with current owners who bought in good faith, but they'll contribute to the settlement fund. Tucker stared at him. 15 million? It's more than the class action will probably award. It's immediate instead of years away. And it comes with my public acknowledgement that my grandfather committed fraud and conspiracy. Full apology. No more spin. What do you want in return? I want you to recommend the families accept it. I want you to publicly state that justice has been served, and I want this to end before it destroys more lives. Tucker leaned back against the picnic table. $15 million, nearly $1 million per family, plus land returned, plus public acknowledgement. It was more than he'd hoped for when he opened that shelter. Why do you need me to recommend it? Because you're the one who exposed this. You gave up your inheritance to do it. The families trust you. If you say this is fair, they'll believe it. If you say we should fight for more, they'll fight. And you're hoping I'll say it's fair. I'm hoping you'll say it's enough, that it's time for healing instead of revenge. Tucker thought about Martha Yates, 78 years old, waiting for justice her whole life. About Robert Chen and Edwin Cross and all the others who'd lived with their family's shame. About whether they'd rather have immediate compensation or years more of litigation with uncertain outcome. I need to talk to the families first, get their input, of course. But Tucker, think about this carefully. Perfect justice doesn't exist. Not after 70 years. We can have good enough justice now, or we can fight for perfect justice that might never come. Carlisle left. Tucker sat at that rest stop for an hour, watching traffic pass on the highway, trying to figure out what Roy would want him to do. The old man had sealed the evidence but couldn't bring himself to expose it, had lived 70 years in the gray area between truth and silence. Would he want Tucker to accept compromise or demand full accountability? Tucker called Grace, told her about the offer. $15 million is significant, she said carefully. More than I expected Carlisle would offer. But less than the land is worth. The land isn't available. Current owners won't give it up. We'd be fighting for monetary damages anyway. 15 million immediate versus maybe 10 million in 5 years after legal fees? The math favors settlement. It feels like letting them off easy. It's letting the families have compensation while they're still alive to use it. Martha Yates could have a comfortable retirement. Robert Chen could help his grandchildren. Edwin Cross could donate to Native American causes he cares about. Waiting for perfect justice means some of them die before seeing any justice. Tucker drove to Martha's house that afternoon. She made coffee and they sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of families she'd lost too young. $15 million split 18 ways, Tucker said. About $830,000 per family. Plus Carlisle would transfer back 5 properties to families who want to ranch again. And public acknowledgement of the conspiracy. Martha was quiet for a long time. My father died waiting for justice. My mother died waiting. I've waited 70 years to have someone admit they weren't failures. If Carlisle publicly acknowledges what his grandfather did, if he admits it was theft, that's worth more than money. But the money matters too. The money would mean my grandchildren could go to college without debt, could buy homes, could have the security my father wanted to give us. She looked at Tucker with eyes that had seen too much loss. What do you think I should do? I think you should get what you deserve, all of it. Every acre of land, every dollar stolen, everything. But you don't think that's possible. No, ma'am, I don't. Martha nodded slowly. Then I'll take what's possible. I'll take acknowledgement and compensation And the knowledge that my father's name is cleared. That's more than I had 2 weeks ago. Tucker visited the other families over the next 3 days. Robert Chen said yes immediately, wanting to move forward instead of fighting for years. Edwin Cross was harder to convince, wanting full restitution, but eventually agreeing that his age and health made immediate settlement more practical than prolonged litigation. Of the 18 families, 16 said yes within a week. 2 wanted to fight for more, but agreed to accept the majority decision. The settlement was announced the following Monday. Senator Carlisle held a press conference with all 18 families present. He stood at a podium with Tucker and Grace beside him, cameras rolling, reporters taking notes. "I'm here today to acknowledge a terrible injustice," Carlisle said, reading from prepared remarks but speaking with what seemed like genuine emotion. "My grandfather, Judge Walter Carlisle, conspired with others in 1952 and 1953 to illegally foreclose on properties belonging to servicemen deployed to Korea. They violated federal law. They violated basic human decency. They stole from families who were sacrificing everything for this country." He paused, looking at the families gathered. "No amount of money can undo that harm. No apology can restore what was taken. But I can acknowledge the truth. I can take responsibility for benefiting from those crimes, even though I didn't commit them. And I can offer restitution. $15 million will be distributed equally to the 18 affected families. 5 properties will be transferred back to families who wish to return to ranching. And I will personally fund a memorial scholarship program for descendants of the displaced families." Martha Yates stood up from her seat, walked to the podium. Carlisle stepped aside, letting her speak. "My father was Daniel Yates. He served in Korea while my mother tried to save our ranch. They failed because the system was rigged against them. My father died thinking he'd let his family down. Today, 70 years later, we finally have proof he didn't fail. He was robbed." Her voice was steady but fierce. "This settlement doesn't make everything right, but it makes something right, and that's more than we've had in 7 decades. The room erupted in applause. Tucker stood to the side watching. This was what justice looked like when perfect wasn't possible. Imperfect acknowledgement, partial restitution, families getting less than they deserved, but more than they'd had. Not the ending he'd imagined when he cut that chain on the shelter door, but maybe the ending Roy had hoped for when he sealed the truth inside. After the press conference, Tucker walked outside to find Sheriff Pruitt waiting by a patrol car. "That took courage," Pruitt said, "recommending settlement when you could have pushed for more. They deserved more. They deserved everything, but they're getting something. Because of you." Pruitt handed Tucker an envelope. "My family is contributing to the settlement fund, $250,000 from the Pruitt estate. It's what we should have paid 70 years ago." Tucker took the envelope, surprised. "The settlement already covers restitution. This is separate, personal. My grandfather stole from those families. I can't undo that, but I can acknowledge it." Pruitt's voice was rough. "I've lived my whole life benefiting from theft. At least now I'm paying something back." Over the next month, the settlement was finalized. $15 million plus Pruitt's contribution was divided among the families. Tucker helped distribute the funds, personally delivering checks to each household. Martha Yates cried when she got hers. Robert Chen hugged him. Edwin Cross blessed him in Lakota, words Tucker didn't understand but felt the weight of. The Historical Society transferred the ranch property to a trust benefiting the displaced families. Tucker had 60 days to vacate, which became 90 after he negotiated an extension to help with the transition. He spent those months cataloging Roy's possessions, preserving documents for the county museum, preparing the land for new stewardship. Grace was with him the day he packed the last boxes from the house. They worked in silence, wrapping photographs and books, boxing up a century of Bodine family history. In the study, Tucker found one more envelope hidden behind a loose board. Roy's handwriting on the front simply said, "For after." Inside was a cashier's check dated 3 months before Roy died, made out to Tucker Bodine. Amount, $127,000, the inheritance of money from the bank account. And a note. "Tucker, if you're reading this, you opened the shelter and chose truth over money. I knew you might. That's why I hid this. The inheritance in the bank was clean money, earned from ranching after I stopped participating in the conspiracy. It's yours regardless of what you did with the shelter. I transferred it to this check before I died. Gave it to Clayton Hughes with instructions to hide it in this spot and tell no one. It's not much, but it's honest. Use it to start over. You earned it by being brave enough to do what I couldn't. I'm proud of you. Roy. Tucker stood holding the check, feeling emotions he couldn't name. Roy had planned for this, had known Tucker might choose truth, had protected him with one last gift, $127,000. Enough to restart his life, enough to help Melissa, enough to breathe. He showed Grace. She read the note and smiled through tears. He knew you'd do it, knew you'd choose right over easy. He gave me a safety net. He gave you the inheritance you actually deserved, the one earned by courage instead of theft. Tucker's last day on the ranch came in early March. The snow had melted, revealing grass greening underneath. Spring was coming to the prairie. Grace helped him load the final boxes into his truck. They stood on the porch one last time, looking out over the land that had belonged to the Bodine family for 100 years. What will you do? Grace asked. Go back to Omaha, pay my debts, find work, maybe take some classes, figure out who I am when I'm not defined by Roy's choices. And Melissa? I've got money for her college fund now, for her future. She'll understand someday why I did this. Grace handed him a folder. The families want you to have this. Inside were 18 letters, one from each family. Personal notes thanking him for exposing the truth, for giving up his inheritance so they could have acknowledgement, for choosing their justice over his comfort. Martha Yates had written that her father would have been honored to know Tucker. Robert Chen said he'd found peace finally. Edwin Cross wrote that Tucker had helped heal a 70-year wound. Tucker read them all sitting in his truck, unable to start the engine and drive away. These letters were worth more than $2 million, were worth more than 800 acres, were worth everything he'd lost and more. Finally, he started the truck. Grace waved from the porch as he drove down the ranch road one last time. In his rearview mirror, he could see the storm shelter, doors sealed again, empty now of secrets but full of history. A concrete tomb that had held the truth for 70 years until someone was brave enough to open it. Tucker drove east toward Omaha and whatever came next. Behind him, the prairie stretched endless under spring sky. Ahead, a future built on choices he could live with. The inheritance Roy had really left him wasn't money or land. It was the example of how not to live and the grace to choose better. The check in Tucker's pocket felt light. $127,000, honestly earned, his grandfather's final gift. Not blood money, not stolen wealth, just a safety net woven from late regret and distant pride. It wouldn't make him rich, wouldn't erase the struggle ahead, but it would give him space to breathe while he rebuilt. And sometimes, Tucker thought, watching Nebraska roll past his windows, space to breathe is all a man really needs. That and the knowledge that when it mattered, when the choice came down to comfort or conscience, he'd chosen right. The road stretched ahead. Tucker drove toward it, leaving behind a ranch he'd lost and carrying forward a legacy he'd earned. Roy's shame was buried. The families had their acknowledgement. Justice had been served imperfectly but genuinely. And Tucker Bodine, grandson of a conspirator, former owner of 800 stolen acres, was free. 6 months after leaving the ranch, Tucker stood in the parking lot of a community college in Omaha, watching students flow between buildings with the purposeful energy of people building futures. He'd enrolled in welding certification classes using part of Roy's inheritance money. The work was similar to construction but more specialized, better paying with steadier hours. At 30 years old, he was starting over, learning a trade he should have learned a decade ago, building the foundation he'd never had time to build while bouncing between Army deployments and survival jobs. The April morning was warm, promise of summer in the air. Tucker had 15 minutes before his first class. He sat on a bench and pulled out his phone, checked email. 3 messages from Grace, updating him on the memorial project. 1 from Jennifer about Melissa's upcoming birthday. 1 from Martha Yates with a photograph attached. He opened Martha's email first. The photo showed an elderly woman standing in front of a small ranch house, holding a sign that read Yates Family Ranch, established. 1892, restored 2025. Martha's granddaughter and her husband had used the settlement money to buy back 200 acres of the original Yates property. Not the full 640 they'd lost, but enough to run cattle and call themselves ranchers again. Enough to restore the family name. Martha's message was brief. Thought you'd want to see this. My father would be proud. So would yours. Thank you for everything. M. Tucker studied the photograph. 3 generations standing on land their family had lost 70 years ago. The young couple looked determined and hopeful. Martha looked peaceful. It wasn't complete justice, but it was something real and good growing from the ashes of old wrongs. Jennifer's email was more complicated. Tucker, Melissa wants to come stay with you for a week this summer. She's been asking about Nebraska and what you did there. I think she's old enough to understand now. Let me know if you can make it work. J. Tucker looked at his apartment building across the parking lot. 1-bedroom efficiency, clean but small. He'd been sleeping on the couch so Melissa could have the bedroom during her weekend visits. A week would be tight, but the fact that Jennifer was asking, that Melissa wanted to come, felt like progress. Like maybe his daughter was starting to understand why her father had chosen truth over money. He typed a quick response. Yes, anytime, I'll make it work. Grace's emails were about the memorial dedication ceremony scheduled for June. The Historical Society had commissioned a granite monument to be placed at the site of Roy's storm shelter. The shelter itself had been preserved as part of a small museum explaining the conspiracy and honoring the displaced families. Grace had been working with the county for months to get everything ready. The ceremony would include all 18 families, speeches, a moment of silence. Tucker was expected to attend and say a few words. The idea of public speaking made him uncomfortable, but he owed the families that much. Owed Roy that much too. His grandfather had spent 70 years silent. The least Tucker could do was speak. His phone rang. Unknown number with a Nebraska area code. Tucker answered. Mr. Bodine, this is Robert Chen. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all. How are you, sir? Well, thank you. I wanted to let you know my son and I purchased 400 acres adjacent to the old Chen family property. We're starting a cattle operation, bringing the family back to ranching after 70 years. Tucker felt something warm in his chest. That's wonderful. It wouldn't have been possible without the settlement, without what you did. Robert's voice was thick with emotion. My father died thinking our family had failed. My grandfather died thinking he'd dishonored his parents. You gave us the truth, gave us the chance to come home. They talked for a few more minutes about cattle breeds and grass management and the practical details of ranching. Then Robert said something that stayed with Tucker long after the call ended. My grandfather used to say that land has memory, that it remembers who walked on it, who worked it, who loved it. For 70 years, our land remembered us even though we couldn't come back to it. Now we're home. The land knows us again. Tucker sat on that bench thinking about land and memory and the weight of history. Roy's ranch was being managed by a trust now, leased to a young couple who hadn't been alive when the conspiracy happened. The land didn't care who owned it, but the people who'd been stolen from, who'd carried that loss for decades, they cared. And now some of them were coming home. His welding class was small, 8 students ranging from teenagers to men in their 50s. The instructor was a Vietnam vet named Carl who'd spent 40 years in fabrication. He taught with the patience of someone who understood that learning a skill took time and repetition. Tucker appreciated that, appreciated the focus required to create clean welds, the satisfaction of metal joining properly, the tangible proof of work done right. During break, Carl pulled him aside. Saw you on the news a few months back. That Nebraska land thing. That took guts. Or stupidity. Nah, guts. I did some reading about it after. What your grandfather documented, what you exposed, that's the kind of thing that needs exposing. Carl lit a cigarette outside the shop. I came back from Vietnam to find out the VA had lost my disability paperwork. Took me 3 years to straighten out. Meanwhile, I'm working jobs that aggravated my back injury because I couldn't afford not to work. System doesn't protect people the way it's supposed to. Your grandfather helped prove that. He was part of the system that failed them. He was, but he documented it, left you the tools to make it right. That counts for something. Tucker thought about that during the afternoon session. Roy had been complicit in terrible crimes, had benefited from them, had stayed silent for decades. But in the end, he'd preserved the truth even though it incriminated him, had chosen to be remembered accurately instead of kindly. That took a different kind of courage, the courage to face judgment after death. Evening found Tucker at a diner near his apartment, eating a late dinner and reviewing notes for his next day's class. The diner was mostly empty, just a few regulars and a tired waitress who refilled his coffee without asking. Tucker was deep in welding technique diagrams when someone slid into the booth across from him. Sheriff Dale Pruitt, out of uniform, looking older and more weathered than he had 6 months ago. Heard you were living in Omaha now. Took some asking around to find you. Tucker closed his notebook. What brings you all the way here? Wanted to update you on some things. Figured I owed you that much. Pruitt ordered coffee from the waitress. Senator Carlisle resigned his seat. The settlement and public acknowledgement destroyed his political career. He's selling off most of the family land holdings. Keeps enough to live on, but the empire is done. How do you feel about that? Complicated. Ray Carlisle is a bastard in a lot of ways, but he's also a man who inherited his grandfather's sins and tried to manage them the best he could. Now he's paying the price for crimes he didn't commit. Not sure that's justice either. Tucker sipped his coffee. Justice is messy. It is. Pruitt stirred sugar into his cup. My family's in a similar position. We contributed $250,000 to the settlement, but we're also selling property. Can't keep ranching on land we know was stolen. My wife and I talked about it for months. Decided we'd rather start smaller with a clear conscience than stay comfortable carrying shame. What will you do? Keep being sheriff until the next election. After that, maybe something else. My son comes home from Afghanistan next month. Honorable discharge. He's talking about going to college on the GI Bill. Maybe I'll do the same. Never too old to learn something new. They talked for an hour about the settlement's ripple effects. Property sales, title transfers, families moving back to Custer County. The Historical Society was thriving with new donations and visitors coming to see the Storm Shelter Museum. The controversy had divided the community, but also brought attention and resources. Grace Thornton had been hired full-time as museum director. She asks about you, Pruitt said. Grace asks if I've heard from you, how you're doing. I email her sometimes, about the memorial mostly. She's single, you know, in case you were wondering. Tucker smiled slightly. I'm in no position to be thinking about that. Still figuring out how to be a decent father to the daughter I already have. Fair enough. Pruitt stood to leave. The memorial dedication is June 15th. Hope you'll be there. Families want to see you, want to thank you proper. After Pruitt left, Tucker sat alone in the booth thinking about the web of consequences that spread from one choice. He'd opened a shelter and lost an inheritance. That loss had led to a settlement that changed 18 families. Those families were changing the community. The community's change was affecting people like Pruitt and Carlisle. And all of it traced back to a decision Roy made 70 years ago to document crimes instead of just committing them. May passed in a rhythm of classes and study. Tucker's welding skills improved. He picked up weekend work at a small fabrication shop, adding to his savings. Paid off his debts one by one. Fixed his truck. Started building the kind of stability he'd never had. Simple things, but they felt like progress. Melissa came to stay for a week in late May. Tucker took time off work and school, showed her around Omaha, took her to the zoo and the art museum, and for ice cream at places he'd discovered since moving back. She was 9 now, smart and perceptive, with Jennifer's eyes and Tucker's stubborn chin. On the third day, sitting in a park watching ducks on a pond, Melissa asked the question Tucker had been waiting for. Did you really give up millions of dollars? I did. Why? Tucker thought about how to explain it in a way a 9-year-old could understand. You know how sometimes you see someone getting picked on at school, and you know it's wrong, but it's easier to just walk past and not get involved? Yeah. Well, I found out that a long time ago, some bad men picked on families while their dads were away at war. They stole the family's homes and land, and my great-grandfather was one of the bad men. Melissa was quiet, processing. That's really bad. It is, and I found proof of what they did. But to use that proof, I had to give up money that came from those bad things. I had to choose between keeping money that came from stealing or giving it up to help the families who got hurt. So you helped the families. I tried to. Did it work? Tucker thought about Martha standing in front of the restored Yates Ranch, about Robert Chen bringing his family back to land that remembered them, about 18 families getting acknowledgement and compensation after 70 years. Yeah, Bug, I think it worked. Melissa nodded seriously. Then she said something that made Tucker's throat tight. I'm glad you did the right thing. Even though it was hard, Mom says that's what brave means. Doing the right thing when it's hard. Tucker pulled his daughter close. Your mom's a smart woman. The week passed too quickly. Melissa went home with promises to visit again soon. Jennifer sent a text that evening. She hasn't stopped talking about how proud she is of her dad. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Tucker saved that text, read it on bad days when doubt crept in about whether he'd made the right choice. His daughter was proud of him. That was worth more than $2 million. June arrived hot and humid. Tucker finished his welding certification and got hired full-time at the fabrication shop. The pay wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, with benefits and room for advancement. He moved to a slightly larger apartment, 2 bedrooms, so Melissa would have her own space when she visited. The memorial dedication was scheduled for Saturday, June 15th. Tucker drove out to Nebraska on Friday afternoon, the landscape familiar now in a way that tugged at something deep in his chest. He'd only lived on the ranch for a few months, but it felt like home in a way Omaha never quite did. The prairie had gotten into his blood somehow, the wide horizons and endless grass, and the particular quality of light at sunset. He stayed at a motel in Broken Bow. Grace picked him up for dinner at the Cattleman's Diner, the same place they'd first met to discuss the foreclosures. She looked good, happy in a way he hadn't seen 6 months ago when the weight of research and uncertainty had pressed down on her. "The museum is doing better than we projected," she said over coffee. "We're getting school groups from 3 states, historians coming to study the documents, veterans organizations using it as an example of why the Service Members' Civil Relief Act matters." Roy would be surprised his shame turned into education. Maybe that's the best kind of redemption, turning sins into lessons so they don't get repeated. They talked about the settlement families. Martha Yates was in good health, spending time with great-grandchildren who would grow up knowing their family wasn't marked by failure. Robert Chen's son was running the new ranch with modern, sustainable practices, making it profitable in ways the original ranch never could have been. Edwin Cross had donated a portion of his settlement to a Native American legal defense fund, helping other families fight for land rights. 5 of the families bought back portions of their original properties, Grace said. 3 others invested the money in education and businesses. The rest are saving it for retirement and their kids' futures. Every single one of them says it changed their lives. What about the ones who lost land in the settlement? The current owners who had to contribute? Grace's expression grew more serious. That's been harder. Some understood and accepted it. Others are angry, feel like they're being punished for their grandparents' crimes. The community is still divided, probably will be for a long time. Prewitt told me Carlisle sold most of his holdings. He did. The Carlisle empire is basically gone. He kept about 5,000 acres in a modest house, lives quietly, doesn't do interviews or public appearances anymore. Do you feel bad for him? Grace considered the question. I feel bad that he was born into a poisoned legacy, but I don't feel bad that he's facing consequences. He spent decades protecting that legacy instead of exposing it. He chose comfort over truth just like his grandfather did. Just like your grandfather did until he couldn't anymore. Saturday morning dawned clear and perfect. Tucker dressed in his good jeans and the sport coat he'd bought for the occasion. Drove out to the ranch with Grace. The property looked different now. The Historical Society had added a parking area and walking path leading to the storm shelter. A white tent was set up on the hillside for the ceremony, chairs arranged in rows. At least 200 people were already gathering. Tucker recognized many faces. The 18 families and their extended relations, Sheriff Prewitt in uniform, standing with his wife and son, who'd just returned from Afghanistan, county commissioners who'd supported the settlement, journalists covering the dedication, and at the front, a granite monument 8 feet tall, draped with a white cloth waiting to be unveiled. Martha Yates saw Tucker and walked over. She moved slowly but steadily, leaning on a cane but upright and dignified. She took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for all of it. I should be thanking you. You and the other families, you're the ones who lived with the injustice. I just opened a door. You did more than that. You chose truth when you could have chosen comfort. You gave us acknowledgement. You gave us proof our parents and grandparents weren't failures." Her eyes were bright. "My father can rest easy now. Wherever he is, he knows the truth came out." The ceremony started at 10. Grace spoke first, explaining the history and the conspiracy. Then representatives from each of the 18 families came forward, placing flowers at the base of the monument and speaking briefly about what the settlement meant to them. Robert Chen talked about his grandfather's shame being erased. Edwin Cross spoke about healing generational wounds. Martha's granddaughter described buying back the family ranch and restoring the family name. Sheriff Prewitt spoke about his grandfather's crimes and his family's decision to contribute to the settlement. His voice was steady but emotional. I can't undo what my grandfather did, but I can acknowledge it. I can work to make sure nothing like this happens again. And I can teach my son that integrity matters more than wealth, truth matters more than comfort, and justice delayed is still worth pursuing. Then it was Tucker's time to speak. He walked to the podium with notes he'd written and rewritten a dozen times, looked out at the faces gathered, people who'd suffered because of choices made 70 years ago, people who'd waited their whole lives for acknowledgement, people who'd been hurt by the truth but accepted it anyway. He set his notes aside and spoke from the heart. I didn't know my grandfather well. Roy Bodine was a distant man. I grew up thinking he was just old and set in his ways. I didn't understand until I opened that shelter that he was carrying guilt so heavy it carved him hollow. He'd participated in terrible crimes, helped steal from families whose men were serving their country, lived his whole life knowing what he'd done and not having the courage to expose it. Tucker paused, gathering thoughts. But he documented it, every detail, every family, every crime, and he sealed it in a storm shelter with instructions not to open it, but also with a confession meant to be heard someday. He couldn't make it right himself, but he left tools for someone else to make it right. That's not redemption exactly, but it's something. It's an admission that what he did was wrong. It's a hope that someday, somehow, justice would matter more than secrecy. The crowd was silent, attentive. I didn't open that shelter to be a hero. I did it because I couldn't live with myself knowing the truth was buried and families were suffering without acknowledgement. I gave up an inheritance, and I'd do it again. Because standing here now, seeing families restored, seeing land returned, seeing justice served even imperfectly, I know it was worth it. My grandfather couldn't make the right choice while he was alive. I'm grateful I had the chance to make it for both of us. Tucker stepped back from the podium. The crowd applauded. He caught Grace's eye and saw tears on her face. Saw Martha nodding with satisfaction. Saw Sheriff Pruitt's son in his Army uniform standing at attention, saluting in recognition of something Tucker couldn't quite name, but felt the weight of. The cloth was pulled from the monument. The granite was polished black, engraved with 18 names and a simple inscription. In memory of the families displaced by the Custer County Land Conspiracy, 1952 to 1954. Their loss was not failure but theft. Their truth was silenced but not forgotten. May this stand as witness that justice, however delayed, still matters. Below the inscription, a quote attributed to Roy Bodine, taken from his confession tape. Some debts can't be paid in full, but they can be acknowledged. May those I wronged find peace in knowing the truth is finally told. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups talking and sharing memories. Tucker found himself surrounded by family members wanting to thank him, to share what the settlement had meant, to tell him about their plans for the future. It was overwhelming and humbling and made him understand in a way he hadn't before that opening that shelter had been about more than exposing crimes. It had been about giving people permission to stop carrying shame that wasn't theirs to carry. As the crowd dispersed, Tucker walked to the storm shelter. The door was sealed again, protected now by glass panels so visitors could look inside without disturbing anything. The shelves were still there, empty now of documents, but labeled with descriptions of what each had contained. Educational placards explained the conspiracy in detail. A video screen played a portion of Roy's confession, his voice echoing in the concrete space. Tucker stood listening to his grandfather confess to crimes 70 years old. The words were the same as they'd been that night when he first opened the shelter, but they sounded different now. Less like confession and more like testimony. Less about guilt and more about truth. Grace found him there as the sun was setting. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay. Good, actually. This feels right." "It is right." She stood beside him looking at the shelter. "Your grandfather would be proud. Probably surprised too. I don't think he expected anyone would actually have the courage to open this. He left me the key, literally and figuratively. He wanted it opened, just couldn't do it himself." They walked back to the parking area as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Most of the crowd had left. A few families lingered, taking photographs of the monument, saying quiet goodbyes to the place where their history had been both buried and revealed. Tucker drove back to Omaha the next morning. The highway stretched east across familiar landscape. Behind him, Nebraska prairie, where 18 families had lost everything, and now some were coming home. Ahead, a city where he was building a life from honest work and clean money. In his rearview mirror, the past was finally settled. In front of him, a future he could live with. Summer passed into fall. Tucker's skills at the fabrication shop improved. He took on more complex projects, got a raise, started thinking about maybe buying a house someday instead of renting. Melissa came to visit every other weekend. They were building a relationship based on truth and effort instead of guilt and distance. She was doing better in school. The bullying had stopped. Jennifer said their daughter talked proudly about her father now, about the man who chose right over easy. In September, Grace called with news. The memorial is getting used for something we didn't expect. Veteran families from other states are visiting, bringing their own stories of fraud and theft during military service. The shelter has become a symbol, a reminder that the system doesn't always protect the people it should. Is that good or bad? Both probably. It's stirring up old pain, but it's also validating people's experiences, showing them they're not alone. That's powerful. October brought the first hard frost. Tucker was welding a custom gate for a ranch outside Omaha when his phone rang. Martha Yates's granddaughter. Mr. Bodine, I wanted to let you know, Martha passed away last night, peacefully in her sleep. She was 79. Tucker set down his torch. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. She was happy at the end. She got to see the ranch restored, got to know the truth about her father, got to watch her great-grandchildren grow up on land she thought was lost forever. She died at peace. She wanted you to know that. The funeral was small, family only, but Tucker made the drive to Nebraska anyway. Stood at the back of the church listening to Martha's children and grandchildren talk about a woman who'd carried loss her whole life and finally, in her last years, found acknowledgement. She'd lived 70 years with the weight of her father's supposed failure, had spent her final year knowing it was theft, not failure. That year had changed everything. At the graveside, Martha's granddaughter approached Tucker. She left something for you, asked me to give it to you after she passed. It was a small wooden box, handmade, worn smooth with age. Inside was a letter in Martha's handwriting and a photograph. The letter was brief. Tucker, this photo is my father in his Army uniform, 1952, before he deployed to Korea, before everything fell apart. I want you to have it. You gave my father his honor back. You proved he wasn't a failure. That's worth more than all the land we lost. Thank you for opening that door. Thank you for choosing truth. May you find the peace my father never got to find. Martha. The photograph showed a young man in uniform, serious and proud, the same expression Tucker had seen in his own military photos. A man ready to serve his country, not knowing his sacrifice would be rewarded with theft. Tucker tucked the photo into his wallet next to the picture of Melissa, carried it as a reminder of why truth mattered more than comfort. November came cold and gray. Tucker was offered a supervisor position at the fabrication shop. More responsibility, better pay, a chance to train younger workers the way Carl had trained him. He accepted and found he was good at teaching, good at showing people how to create something solid and useful from raw materials. There was a metaphor in that somewhere. Grace called on Thanksgiving. The museum hit 10,000 visitors this year. We're adding exhibits about other historical injustices in Nebraska. The storm shelter is becoming part of a larger conversation about truth and accountability. That's good. It is. And Tucker, I've been thinking, the 1-year anniversary of the shelter opening is coming up in February. We're planning an event, wondering if you'd come speak. About what? About choosing courage over comfort, about what it costs and why it's worth it. Tucker thought about the year since he'd cut that chain and opened the steel door. He'd lost $2 million and 800 acres. But he'd gained peace with his daughter, respect from people he admired, and the knowledge that when it mattered, he'd done the right thing. Not a fair trade in financial terms, but fair in the ways that actually mattered. I'll be there. December brought snow in the holiday season. Tucker spent Christmas with Melissa, just the two of them in his apartment. They cooked dinner together, watched movies, talked about her school and his work and the plans they were making for summer. She wanted to visit Nebraska again, see the memorial, understand more about what her father had done and why it mattered. Will you take me to see the shelter? She asked. If you want. I do. I want to understand what Great-Grandpa Roy did and what you did to make it right. On New Year's Eve, alone in his apartment while Melissa was with her mother, Tucker took stock of the year. Started with nothing but shame and confusion about his inheritance. Ended with honest work, a relationship with his daughter, and peace about choices made. The math didn't add up in dollars, but in the ledger that actually mattered, he was ahead. February arrived with the anniversary event at the museum. Tucker drove out to Nebraska in a snowstorm, the highway barely visible, the world reduced to white and gray. He arrived late, apologizing to Grace, who just smiled and said the weather had delayed everything anyway. The event was held in the museum's main hall with the storm shelter visible through windows. 50 people gathered, mostly families and descendants, some journalists and historians. Tucker spoke about the year since opening the shelter, talked honestly about the costs and benefits, acknowledged that justice was imperfect and delayed and insufficient, but still better than silence. After his speech, a young woman approached. She was maybe 25, carrying a notebook and recorder. "Mr. Bodine, I'm Sarah Chen, Robert Chen's granddaughter. I'm studying law at Nebraska. After hearing our family's story, I decided to specialize in veterans' rights and historical justice cases. I wanted to thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference." Tucker shook her hand, humbled. "Your great-grandfather was the brave one. He survived the theft and kept his family together. I just opened a door. You did more than that. You showed us that truth matters, that standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything, is worth it. I'm going to spend my career fighting for people like my great-grandfather, because you proved it's possible to win." Over the course of the evening, Tucker met others whose lives had changed because of the shelter's opening. A teacher developing curriculum about the Service Members Civil Relief Act. A veteran who'd successfully fought foreclosure by citing the Custer County case as precedent. A filmmaker making a documentary about historical land theft. The ripples kept spreading. Late that night, after the event ended, Tucker and Grace walked to the storm shelter one last time. Snow was still falling, covering the prairie in fresh white. The monument stood dark against the pale ground, the names of the 18 families barely visible in the dim light. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Giving up the inheritance?" Tucker thought about Martha dying at peace, about Robert Chen's granddaughter becoming a lawyer to fight for justice, about his own daughter being proud of her father, about sleeping without guilt gnawing at his conscience. "No, I don't regret it." They stood in the falling snow. Two people who'd chosen truth when choosing comfort would have been easier. The shelter behind them was empty of secrets now, but full of history, a testament to what one man had documented and another had exposed, to crimes acknowledged and justice served imperfectly but genuinely. Tucker drove back to Omaha as dawn broke over the prairie. The snow had stopped, leaving everything clean and bright. Behind him, a memorial to 18 families and the conspiracy that stole their homes. Ahead, a life built on choices he could defend and work he could be proud of. In his wallet, a photograph of Martha's father in uniform and a picture of his own daughter smiling. Roy Bodine had sealed a shelter with crimes documented and conscience unburdened only in death. Tucker had opened it and set the truth free. The old man had carried shame for 70 years. His grandson would carry the knowledge that when his moment came, when the choice stood between comfort and courage, he'd chosen right. That was the real inheritance, not land or money, but the example of how not to live and the grace to choose better. Tucker Bodine had received that inheritance and honored it, and in doing so had finally put his grandfather's ghost to rest. The highway stretched ahead, leading toward a future honest and earned. Tucker drove toward it, carrying nothing heavier than the hope that his daughter would someday face her own hard choices and remember that her father chose truth when it mattered most. That legacy, more than any acres or dollars, was worth passing on. The prairie rolled past his windows, endless and clean under new snow. Somewhere behind him, families were coming home to land that remembered them. Somewhere ahead, others were learning that justice mattered, that truth mattered, that courage mattered. And in between, Tucker was building a life he could live with. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything that actually counted.